A gangster-looking man is running along a dark alley, trying to hide from someone. He stops and looks back, but doesn't notice anyone there. But when he turns back, someone holds a knife to his throat. A man begs an unknown person to stop as people pass by without noticing them. However, the unknown person showed no mercy and killed the man. A 17-year-old black-haired guy, a high school student and part-time assassin named Kyle, walks down the street with a bag on his shoulder, yawning. Kyle walks into the classroom, and everyone immediately turns to him and starts whispering. Student number 35, a member of the football club and class leader Steve, decides to greet the guy with a wide smile. However, Steve's greeting remains ignored, because Kyle decided to sleep on the desk. This behavior of the guy outrages the unofficial leader of the class girls and student number 22 Roxy. The leader of the bullies and student number 1, Scott, comes into the classroom with a dissatisfied face. Two of his classmates immediately greet him, calling him sir. Without thinking twice, Scott approaches Kyle's desk and calls out to him. Since Kyle didn't pay any attention to Scott, the second one reached out his hand intending to grab the first one. But suddenly someone grabbed him by the wrist. Grabbing the bully by the wrist, Kyle finally looks up at him and notes that he does not intend to chat for long, because he wants to sleep, which greatly angered the other. Suddenly the black-haired man squeezes the other's wrist tightly, practically breaking it. However, he quickly lets him go, apologizing, to which Scott quickly pulls his hand back and calls Kyle a creepy asshole. Suddenly, the main beauty of the class and student number 8, Rose, raises her voice, asking for silence. Intending to start a fight, Scott turns to Rose, but then a girl with a high ponytail appears in front of his face. This girl, namely disciplinary committee member and student number 29 Meryl, calls on the bully to stop before he does anything wrong. The frivolous guy and student number 23 Ryan speaks up. He tells Meryl to stop, because she will be ignored anyway. Suddenly, Kyle notices something strange right under Steve's feet, and he, to his surprise, does not notice it at all. This something turns out to be a blue glow that has arisen from nowhere. Soon this glow, emanating from the pattern on the floor, spreads throughout the entire classroom. However, in the next second the blue light gives way to white and absorbs the entire class along with the students. And all the guys from the class, unconscious, appear in an unknown room made of white stone with many columns and one gate. A little later, the guys regain consciousness, and Steve, having come to his senses, calls on everyone to remain calm. Scott, in turn, decides not to listen to Steve and plans to explore the place they ended up in. But he is stopped by Kyle, who heard someone's approaching steps outside the gate. In his thoughts, Kyle notes that two people are walking, a man and a girl. The gate opens, and a girl dressed in a white robe and a tall, middle-aged man in a black cloak appear before the guys. At the same time, Kyle is hiding behind one of the columns. Smiling, the girl notes that, as she expected, the guys managed to maintain their composure. Teenagers look at strangers with interest. Kyle, in turn, notices that the man is well-built and armed with a sword, but does not notice anything remarkable about the girl. The woman says that she is the Archbishop of the Sacred Country, Dominica Lillian, and next to her is her knight Howard. Scott declares that this is all nonsense, and Lillian is understanding, but still denies this statement. Steve decides to take on the role of diplomat, and tries to politely obtain information. The Archbishop reports that the guys were called to another world, because they and only they are the hope of all mankind, who are able to defeat the King of Demons, the so-called candidates for heroes. Steve was skeptical about this news, and Scott, in turn, called this news nonsense. Knight Howard did not tolerate such an insult to the saint of his country. The man stood up and reached for his sword, deciding to punish the brute. But nothing further followed, because the saint ordered to stop, to which Howard replied that it was better to punish the rude man now. Scott took these words as a challenge, became even more incensed and attacked the knight, who had a weapon with him, with his fists. Suddenly, with a quick swing of his sword, invisible to the human eye, the man cut the guy's forehead. The cut turned out to be shallow, because the sword only touched the skin, but blood gushed out from the cut, which scared the others. Now all the guys were wary, and Lillian, apologizing for the rude reception, decided to tell the reason why they were here. But first she asked everyone to remain quiet. The saint said that in this world, humanity is experiencing an invasion by the King of Demons and is on the verge of extinction. However, Saint Dominica still continues to resist, but she is not able to fully resist the invaders. Lillian again said that the hero candidates were the last hope of this country, which now that the guys knew the situation better alarmed them even more. Now more and more guys began to express their doubts out loud, quietly talking among themselves, and someone even burst into tears, to which Howard said that the guys must defeat the Demon King, because this is the only way to return home. This news struck fear in the hearts of the children. Kyle couldn't tell whether it was a lie or not, but assumed that the man was preparing them for the worst, although it was quite cruel. Scott again decided to rebel, because he was not happy with the prospect of serving and obeying someone unknown. Howard appreciated that the guy had not lost his fighting spirit, which made him a promising fighter, but he considered such disobedience dangerous, and he began to think, reaching for his sword, about the fact that maybe it was worth getting rid of Scott right now. But before the knight could do anything, Lillian touched the guy's face, and light poured from her hands. A second later, the wound on Scott's forehead also began to glow, and soon healed completely. The saint then explained that she healed the wound with the help of the power of witchcraft bestowed by the god of the Dominican Republic, which temporarily brings into the world a new law, or, using the more familiar term, magic. The fact that the inhabitants of this other world knew the concepts of their world alarmed Kyle, and he suggested that most likely this was not the first call. Lillian said that this power is the main reason the guys appeared here, and reached out to Steve with a hand enveloped in light. Suddenly an unusual feeling struck the guy, as if all his organs were turning over inside, and his hand also became enveloped in light, which came from somewhere inside, flowing through his veins. Suddenly this light in his hand began to transform and took the form of a long sword shining with blue light. The saint explained that her power is to awaken the power of blessing in hero candidates, but the power is granted randomly, and cannot be changed. Lillian asked the guys to help her country, despite how selfish it was, but Steve doubted again, because no matter how much power they were given, they would not become any better at fighting. The girl promised that the country would take full care of them while they were training. Steve decided that for the sake of their survival, they should accept this power of blessing and the offer of new acquaintances. Following the guy, others agreed, following his example. The saint began to awaken everyone's powers, and Meryl was able to make her pen float using telekinesis. Scott received a blessing, an explosion. The others also received their blessings and their hands glowed in different colors. The girl asked if everyone had received their blessings, hoping not to miss anyone. In response to this question, Kyle finally came out from behind the column and spoke about what he had not yet received. And so the saint touched the guy with her hand, embraced by a gentle yellow light. Suddenly, it was as if lightning struck the guy's eyes and the irises of his eyes turned red, and for a moment his vision deteriorated. And then above Lillian's head he saw some text in a frame, similar to a game window, in which the name, age and some other indicators were indicated. Seeing that there was something wrong with Kyle's vision, she assumed that he had the blessing, assessment, which is very rare. The saint explained that with the help of this skill one can learn details about the strength and skills of the selected target. Then the guy decided to apply his blessing to himself, looking at his hand and concentrating. Then the same window appeared before his eyes, but the indicators there were different. Suddenly Scott hit his blessing with all his might at the place where Kyle was standing, but fortunately, the guy managed to dodge, and in his place a fairly deep crater appeared. Scott's eyes lit up with an evil light as he looked at Kyle again, showing off his strength. Laughing happily, Roxy said that she was very pleased to see how the always arrogant Kyle was intimidated. The guy wondered why everyone suddenly became so self-confident, because, given the information received, he could not say exactly how useful their powers were. Kyle thought that he couldn't hope for these blessings because no one knew when they would be taken back. But what he was sure of was that there were still many reliable ways to kill a person. Lillian said hopefully that for now the powers were difficult to control, but one day they would become strong, reliable fangs that would pierce the Demon King. And then she sent everyone to rest until tomorrow, because training begins tomorrow. By evening, each of the children who became hero candidates was assigned and escorted to their rooms. But Kyle was not going to sit in his room and relax. He decided to scout out the situation and get more information. In the night, 2 watchmen stood near the walls of the building and discussed candidate heroes, who to one of them seemed like just children, unable to even hold a sword in their hands, much less defeat the Demon King. Standing behind a tree, Kyle watched the 2 watchmen and noted that this was the third patrol and that security had been beefed up. The guy decided to use his power on the sentries. A window appeared above the head of one of the sentinels, in which the only skill was fencing, from which the guy concluded that not everyone has miraculous powers, after which he hastened to hide. Having examined the territory, Kyle roughly understood the geography of the castle, namely that it was a typical fortified city, that is, a castle and a settlement surrounded by a high wall. Hiding in the bushes near the gate leading to the castle, he thought about getting inside, but still postponed this matter. To avoid being seen by anyone, he hid in the tall grass, whose tips reached his ears. As he moved forward, he noticed 3 of his classmates standing in the open area. The girls were arguing about whether it was worth being here so late at night to practice, since it might be prohibited or downright dangerous. Roxy replied, looking at the fire coming from her finger, that she still wouldn't be able to sleep, but at least it would be useful. Kyle decided not to leave, but to follow them a little and how they would use their abilities. How suddenly a rustling sound was heard in the grass, to which one of the girls immediately noticed, and then the others. A moment later, a huge blue monster covered with huge scales, looking like a lizard, crawled out of the grass. Noticing him, Kyle decided to immediately use his ability on him, because he had never seen anything like it before. The guy noted that due to the fact that the monster stunned the girls, it received the sudden status. Growling, the monster quickly rushed at the girls, and they, in turn, ran as quickly as possible from him. Kyle noted that the monster runs fast, but does not seem to be gifted with intelligence, which means defeating it will not be so difficult. The guy thought that despite the fact that the creature is huge, if you use the knife correctly, it can wound it, or even kill it. And then with a sharp movement of his hand he threw the knife straight at the monster, and the knife quickly headed straight towards the monster. The tip of the knife pierced the monster's skin, but did not seriously wound him, but was stuck in his skin. The monster growled questioningly, looking around, unable to determine where something had come at it from. At that time, the girls were still running, driven by fear and panic. They did not want to be eaten on their first day here. When suddenly one of them hits her foot hard on a stone and trips over it. It turned out that it was Roxy, and now she is lying on the ground, unable to run further without someone's help. Meanwhile, the monster is getting closer and closer, seeing a good victim in front of it, and so he swings his huge paw at Roxy. At the same time, the girl only manages to put her hands in front of her, hoping to somehow protect herself. However, the paw does not reach the girl, and the monster's head falls to the ground with a knife stuck into it all the way to the hilt. The girls move away from the monster, not wanting to look at it anymore, while Kyle hides behind a tree, waiting for them to disappear from view. After the girls leave, the guy comes up and pulls his knife out of the monster's head, worrying that since there are such monsters everywhere, you won't be able to walk around in peace anymore. Suddenly, with help, he feels that someone is watching him, and quickly, crouching, hides behind the carcass of the monster. Cautiously peeking out from behind her, Kyle doesn't notice anyone and decides it's time to quickly leave, because it's very suspicious. As soon as the guy leaves, someone dressed in a long black cloak comes out from behind the column. The face of the unknown person is not visible because of the hood. This unknown person comes closer to the monster and gets upset, because, as it turns out, these hero candidates are just a bunch of weaklings. But licking his lips, he notes that there is someone among them with a similar smell of murder and cruelty to him. The next morning, the monster's corpse appears in the room where all the candidates have gathered, and Howard informs everyone that this monster was found near the walls of the castle. The man also informs the guys that the monsters are minions of the Demon King and they love to feast on human flesh, and the guys are now their main target, and then asks a certain Sam if he has found out anything. Sam, a blonde guy with glasses and gloves stained with blood, replies that there are traces of witchcraft in the monster, and that it is the work of at least an average demon. Kyle watches all this from behind a pillar, while Howard suggests that perhaps the Demon King has decided to reconnoiter the situation. Steve decides to ask whether Sam was controlled by a demon, since such a monster could not have appeared in the fortified city unnoticed. Sam confirms this idea by agreeing with the guy and saying that strong demons are able to control monsters using a technique called slave witchcraft. And then he also talks about how monsters are made of mana, and since it turns out that the Demon King is the source of mana, therefore he and his minions are able to control it, and therefore the monsters. Howard interrupts Sam's abstruse speeches and drags him away, saying that they have to go, which makes the second one clearly saddened, because he so wanted to share his knowledge. Yesterday, using his ability, Kyle noted that the monster was in the submission status, and he assumed that he then felt the presence of a demon. However, this demon was skilled and Kyle miraculously managed to notice him, and perhaps he is still wandering around somewhere. Suddenly, someone's voice sounded right in Kyle's head and asked that he was really so scared of his imminent death. It seemed that only the guy himself heard this, which is why he froze in surprise and horror. Scott decided to speak out again, saying that he was not going to stay here for long, because he needed to defeat the Demon King as soon as possible. Rose and Steve agreed with the guy's statement. Kyle assumed that everyone was so bold because they didn't take it all seriously, just as a game, but that's not the case and they need to realize it faster. Lillian entered the hall with quiet steps, urging the guys not to rush. She stated that they do not yet understand the full essence of the powers given to them, and they need training despite the fact that they are developing faster than the indigenous inhabitants of this world. After a week of training, Kyle sat in the library, not understanding what was written in the book, but what was strange was that they could communicate calmly. Hearing the noise, the guy looked out the window. On the street, training was in full swing. Some were practicing magic, some were working out on special simulators, and some were practicing in pairs or groups. A little disappointed, Kyle noted that his assessment ability was not that useful, since he was banned from training with everyone else, but at least he was given access to the library. After reading a large number of books, the guy realized that they contained only the history of the country, but nothing about demons, and got up from the table, deciding to take a break from reading, because anyway he could not find anything useful. Going outside, the guy noted that the saint did not lie. They are developing by leaps and bounds, and he noted that among them there are 5 of the best, namely Ryan with his wind power, Scott with his powerful explosion power, Rose with her control power, Meryl with her earth power, and Roxy with her fire power. However, the one who stood out the most and surpassed everyone was another man, who at that moment knocked the sword out of his instructor's hands. And it was Steve with his sword shining with blue light, which he already wielded as a skilled swordsman. Kyle decided to use his ability on him to see how his performance increased. Seeing his skills window, the guy noted that a week ago all his characteristics were at the DF level, and now they were at the AB level. Even considering that Steve was a genius, this was an incredible leap, so Kyle assumed that the blessing also affected bodies. Suddenly those who had finished training approached the guy and began to mock him, because he did not train with them, but only read books. But Kyle noted that for some reason, everyone began to look down on him due to the result of the growth of their powers, and therefore sent him disdainful smiles. Suddenly one of the guys extended his hand to the guy, when suddenly something quickly hit him in the legs, and the brute flew to the ground. Kyle, with a dangerous expression on his face, asked why he flew like that and whether he was injured. The others stared at the brute in shock because they did not understand what exactly had happened. Scott pointed out that it was worth stopping, because he noticed that the saint was coming this way. And indeed it turned out that Lillian, accompanied by his knight, was heading towards the guys. Suddenly, the knight who was watching the training fell to his knees, and everyone looked sharply at the girl. The saint said that since the progress was higher than expected, the training schedule would be accelerated. Ryan suggested in bewilderment that they wanted to send them to the king of demons himself, to which Lillian answered in the negative. She said that it was time for the guys to fight in a real battle with a real monster. This news stunned the guys. They did not expect this, and were not ready for such training, at least mentally. And Kyle had an excited, but enthusiastic look on his face. Lillian and Howard met the guys in the forest, and the knight announced that their practice would take place in the forest. He also announced that the guys should divide into groups, because they would not be able to move in a large crowd. The first team included Steve, Roxy and another girl, the second team included Scott and 2 more guys, and the third team included Ryan and Meryl. Looking around, Howard asked if everyone had been distributed. Then he noticed Rosie and Kyle standing separately, with their arms folded on their chest. Rosie said that no one invited her to the group, to which the others unanimously thought that they were too afraid to invite her. However, there was nowhere to go, and Rosie and Kyle teamed up to form a 4th team. When the guy thought about his partner, words such as self-confident and cool-blooded immediately popped into his head. Lillian announced that the best team would receive a prize, which made the kids very happy. Rosie and Kyle walked along a forest path at a distance from each other. The girl stated that she had one of the best blessings and asked the guy to just stay out of the way, to which the guy calmly replied that he relied on her. Turning around, Rosie contemptuously noted that Kyle had no pride. To begin with, the guy decided to look at the combat potential of his partner. Using his killer senses, he noticed that he was surrounded by 4 enemies on the left and right, one in front and one behind. Suddenly, a small monster with a club, looking like a green, ugly child, came out of the bushes. Without thinking twice, he immediately rushed at the guys with a vile scream. Rosie used her abilities and everything around began to glow pink. Under the influence of this pink light, the monster was pinned to the ground and could not move. Rosie's ability turns out to be control, which forces her to follow orders. Kyle notified his partner that there were still monsters around, which made the girl worry. She ordered the monster to drop his weapon and put his hands behind his back, which he obediently did. The guy noted that the girl looked tired, to which Rosie replied that if she uses this power for a long time, she will become exhausted. Kyle doubtfully noted that this power had too much energy consumption, and advised him to kill the monster as soon as possible, which discouraged Rosie a little, because the monster was vaguely similar to a human. However, the guy didn't care at all, and he replied that enemies are enemies, and there was no point in leaving him alive. The girl listened to her partner and still agreed that the arguments were very convincing and reasonable. Kyle noted that despite everything, Rosie is still an indecisive schoolgirl, but the main thing is that she makes the right decision when danger comes. More green monsters with clubs appeared ahead, ready to attack at any second, and the girl also pressed them to the ground with her strength. However, this made her breathing hitch, which is clearly not a good indicator and means that soon she will not be able to cast magic. But still it was time to finish with them, and Rosie ordered them to wring their necks. The monsters obeyed unquestioningly and broke their necks. The guy asked whether it was possible to force even this to be done, to which the girl replied that it was possible, but the stronger the opponent, the less the chance of success. The sight of the dead bodies made Rosie even worse, because even though they were monsters, they still looked like people, so this sight was unpleasant. But Kyle looked at the dead bodies not with disgust, but only with a cruel, cold gaze. Rosie didn't expect her partner to be so calm, because he doesn't even have much strength. The guy replied, examining the dead bodies, that he was not the timid type, and these monsters were just weaklings. Kyle invited his partner to come back if she was afraid, but the girl only confidently turned around and walked further into the forest. The guy noted the stable psyche of his partner, with whom he could work. Meryl and Ryan are running away from someone through the forest in fear. They are running completely, not making out the road. Suddenly the guy, cursing, sharply brakes and turns around, followed by his partner. The guys begin to cast magic, and their hands are filled with light of different colors. And combining their skills, they create a stone projectile, driven by a strong wind, which they direct directly at a huge monster. The stone hits the huge monster without harming it, and scatters into many fragments. Ryan falls to the ground in a panic, because he hoped that their attack would work, but now it turns out that they are at a dead end. A huge monster, like a bear, appears in front of the guys, and drool is flowing from its mouth. Rosie remembers her grandfather, who raised her alone since childhood, and her reason for moving back. She is determined to go back and make her grandfather happy. Meanwhile, Rosie and Kyle continue to walk forward so as not to get lost. At least the girl thought it would be right. The guy questions this strategy, because he has often been in the forest and knows that this way they are most likely to get lost. The girl turns around to look at her partner, and the question is spinning in her head about who he is and why he is so strange. Meeting their gazes, Rosie quickly turns back. Suddenly they hear someone's loud screams, in which they recognize Meryl's voice, which makes them worried. Kyle assumed that something bad had happened and asked his partner what they would do. The girl replies without a single doubt that they should go and help, and that she hopes Meryl wasn't hurt. Kyle notices with surprise that his partner is very kind, something he had never noticed about her before. However, the girl perceives this more as an insult, and tries to find out what her partner meant. Covered in wounds, Meryl falls to the ground and hits the dusty ground hard. Ryan asks his partner about her condition, as he noticed how serious her wounds look. The girl barely answers that everything is fine with her, and tells the guy to run away. But Ryan is not going to leave her alone, and he tries to support her. Suddenly a huge shadow falls on the guy, and he turns around in horror, knowing in advance that he will be behind him. Behind, swinging its huge paw, stands a bear monster, but suddenly pink threads wrap around his paw, and the monsters can no longer move it. Ryan is surprised to discover that Rosie is standing in front of him and casting a spell, but the girl will not be able to hold this monster for long. Kyle stands back and watches, noticing that his partner's power affects different enemies differently. The guy is interested in Meryl's condition, and Ryan reports that the wounds are serious, but the girl is still breathing. Then Kyle tells him to take the girl and run away. The guy tries to object, but still, since his partner's wounds are serious, he leaves. Kyle asks Ryan, who is running away, to call Steve or Lillian here to help. Now that this monster has become entirely their problem, the guy decides to use his ability. A window is illuminated above the monster's head, and the guy notes the high level of protection and the new concept of mutant. Noticing the high level of defense, he assumes that the monster has strong fur, like armor. Suddenly Rosie says, breathing heavily, that she can no longer hold the monster. The monster's paws are freed, and he is about to strike, growling in irritation because some people dared to immobilize him. Kyle says they've already bought enough time and now it's time for them to run away. However, the girl suddenly, instead of running away, succumbs to the force of gravity and falls exhausted to the ground. Her legs are shaking, the girl does not feel them and cannot get up, and panic penetrates deeper and deeper into her heart. Meanwhile, the monster is getting closer and closer, thirsting to finally finish off these little people. Meanwhile, Kyle takes something out of his cloak. Suddenly a small green jar flies out, and smoke covers everything around, protecting Rosie from the monster. The guy quickly grabs his partner's feet and lifts her into his arms, and hides with her behind a tree. Kyle warns the girl to remain silent, and she quickly covers her mouth with her hands, because she doesn't want the monster to find them. The guy lowers Rosie to the ground, and meanwhile the bear monster, wondering where his food went, looks around. The girl quietly asks her partner what kind of smoke it was that they used to escape from the bear monster. Kyle replies that it is a smoke bomb that he made out of boredom, but this, of course, is a lie. In fact, since the guy is an assassin, he is always minimally armed, his supplies are limited, and he would not want to waste them quickly. Suddenly Rosie begins to apologize, causing her partner to look at her in bewilderment. The girl explains that she is apologizing, because she was the one who brought him from here, and now she can't help. But the guy just brushes off these apologies, and in return wants to receive gratitude. Rosie thanks her partner with a cute blush on her cheeks, and childishly looks into his eyes. But this doesn't touch the guy at all, and he just turns away and replies that if she had always been like this, people would be drawn to her in droves, which is why the girl gets irritated and begins to be indignant. But Kyle reminds her again to be quiet, and Rosie quickly shuts up. They again consider a plan of action. The girl suggests running, to which her partner replies that there is no point in this and points his head to the side. Suddenly the monster hears some rustling and turns to him, realizing, however, that these are not his past victims. And now Steve's team appears before him, and the guy declares that he is now an opponent of this monster. The guy activates his sword that protects from evil ability, and everything around him is illuminated with a bright blue light. Steve attacks the monster with a scream, holding his sword tightly in his hand. The monster in this one growls, ready to take on a new challenge. The guy makes a quick swing of his sword, hoping to cut the monster's body or cut off a limb. However, he fails to do this, and he only inflicts a shallow wound on him, from which blood begins to actively flow. Suddenly Roxy screams for Steve to move away, begins to concentrate the flames in her hands, and then brings all this flame down on the monster. This action turns out to be very successful, and now the monster's fur is engulfed in flames, and he himself is struggling in agony. Roxy smugly says that she is sure that no one can resist this. Steve quickly finds himself next to his partners again. Suddenly the bear monster growls loudly, spreads its paws, and the flames on its fur die out. Roxy exclaims in horror, not understanding how this can happen. Steve urges her to remain calm, because finally there is a chance. He notices that the girl's attack brought considerable benefit. The monster slowed down. The guy encourages the girls not to give up, because now the three of them together can defeat him. And now together they continue the battle. Steve invariably attacks. Roxy attacks with her flame. The third girl also attacks with her magic. It turns out that someone is watching this battle, and with a smile of sharp teeth, He says that it is only a matter of time. All this time, the experienced demon killer Duncan watched the battle of Steve's team. The demon notices that the monster will not be able to defeat Steve, and admires the speed of his development and his calmness. He calls the guy special. According to the plan, Duncan was supposed to conduct only a small reconnaissance. But now everything has changed. He is going to finish off Steve here and now. Meanwhile, the owner of the magic sword continues to confidently advance on the monster, striking. And then there is a blow, and blood flows like a fountain from the wound. The monster cannot stand on its feet. Steve, without wasting any time, quickly pierces the monster's chest, and the sword goes halfway into the monster's chest. Meanwhile, the demon prepares to attack, intending to teach the guy a lesson about never relaxing. And now the monster is defeated and, without moving, lies on the ground with the sword in his chest. Steve's team stands next to him. Duncan's eyes light up with crazy lights as he watches the guy, running his tongue along the blade of the knife and preparing to attack. Suddenly he feels something strange that makes his body shudder, and panic settles in his heart. Someone put a knife to the demon's throat, which he did not expect at all. This someone turns out to be Kyle, whose eyes closely follow the demon's every move. And the guy now teaches the lesson that one should never relax to the demon, looking at him with cruelty in his eyes. The knife falls from Duncan's hands. The demon raises his hands, indicating that he gives up. Duncan can't believe that someone was able to take him by surprise, because this has never happened before. Suddenly, Kyle quickly stabs the demon's legs with a knife, cutting its tendons. From this unexpected action, as if the attacker had predicted that the demon was going to escape, he falls face down on the ground. The guy leans over his victim's face, without removing the knife from his throat, and quietly tells him to remain silent, because he doesn't want Steve's team to notice them. Kyle says that he wants to ask the demon a few questions and then let him go, but Duncan does not agree to this, asking the guy who he is to do this. The guy replies that he is a shadow from another world, which immediately sticks into the demon's consciousness. And he angrily suggests that it was this creepy aura that he felt when they met for the first time. Meanwhile, Kyle continues and says that he knew what someone would do to them, but could not track down the demon, so he decided to use Steve as bait, which surprised Duncan, because it means the guy knew everything from the very beginning. Kyle replied that he had too little knowledge about this world, and then he wanted to learn about everything from the demon, which the demon was not going to agree to. Suddenly Duncan is struck by severe pain, causing him to scream, and it turns out it was Kyle. The guy threatens to give the demon hell on earth if he doesn't cooperate, to torture him to death. But the demon is not going to obey, and therefore decides to take extreme measures. He clenches his jaw so hard that his teeth begin to grind and something inside his mouth breaks. Suddenly, veins bulge on Duncan's face, blood begins to spurt out of his mouth, and his eyes begin to roll back in his head. His eyes widen, capillaries burst, and blood now begins to flow from every hole possible. After the demon stops convulsing and dies, Kyle assumes that the demon had suicide poison on him so as not to reveal his secrets no matter what. This makes the guy worried, because the army of the Demon King carefully approached the issue, which means that only serious problems can be expected from them. Suddenly, a skill window flashes above the guy's head and begins to make sounds, notifying him of something. However, at the same time, Rosie finds the corpse and Kayla next to it, and looks at the dead body with fear. The guy immediately decides to ask the girl how much she saw and heard. The partner replies that she saw little, only how he fell and nothing more. Pointing to the demon's already blue face, he tells her that it is an assassin from the Demon King's army. This news frightens the girl, and she also asks in horror whether this demon tried to kill them. Kyle responds to this that it is quite obvious that the army was sent in order to get rid of the candidates. Rosie asks her partner how he noticed him, because only he knew about him. In response, the guy decides to tell her the truth and admits that in their world he worked as a hired killer. This news plunges the girl into complete shock. She did not expect to hear exactly this. Kyle says that the girl may not believe him, but the corpse lying in front of them is strong evidence of the veracity of his words. The guy asks his partner not to tell anyone about who he is and what she saw today. Still, as Kyle reminds them, their class is already very worried about Meryl's injury. Rosie promises not to tell anyone and says that, surprisingly, Kyle is very kind and asks why he behaves this way. The guy replies that, unlike him, the others are not used to fighting, so he does this. Meanwhile, He notices that Rosie's ability can be very useful to him, and he can use it for his own purposes in the future. The guys gather around the wounded Meryl, next to whom a girl sits and casts a spell. This girl turns out to be student number 34 named Sarah, who has the blessing, healing. Sarah passes her hand, engulfed in a golden glow, over Meryl's body, and all her wounds disappear in a second, as if they were never there. Ryan asks about his partner's health, to which the girl tells him that Meryl will be completely healthy in an hour. The guy sighs with relief and expresses his admiration for Steve, because the monster was very strong and scary. Steve says that the monster was indeed strong, but together they will defeat anyone, no matter how strong the monster is. Kyle, as usual leaning against a tree, notices Rosie's gaze on him and asks her about it, to which the girl sharply turns away and denies. Lillian finally joins them, accompanied by Howard, and expresses her joy that everyone is back. Ryan, with anger on his face, wonders where they have been all this time. Howard tells the guy that they were nearby and kept an eye on everyone from afar, which makes the guy ask why they didn't help then. With a chuckle, the knight asks a counter question about whether it would be a good training if they helped every time. Then Steve decided to point out that one of the candidates almost died. In response to this, Howard said that in a real battle, every life is on the line and that now only such battles await them, and they should not whine. The guy said that everything they said was a lie, because only weak monsters should be found in this forest. Lillian noted that it could have been the work of a demon killer. She said that initially there were no armored bears in this forest, which means that someone decided to test the strength of the candidates from it. Howard suggested that this killer demo was still somewhere in the forest, to which the saint replied that it was necessary to strengthen security. And also, in the girl's opinion, it is necessary to strengthen training, otherwise all the candidates will simply be killed. A wave of dissatisfied comments went through the crowd. Steve decided that it was necessary to avoid intensifying training, and therefore attributed this not very successful outcome to anxiety, and called this decision ridiculous. But Lillian was adamant. She replied that even if it was ridiculous, you had to go through it, otherwise everyone would just be killed. Scott butted into the conversation, not wanting to listen to Lillian. Suddenly Howard appeared right in front of the guy, as if he could teleport, and he furiously explained that they were all just pawns of Mrs. Lillian, and they had no right to disobey her, and the sooner they understood this, the better. This statement surprised and shocked all the candidates, because before everyone had told them that they were great heroes, but as it turned out, everything was completely wrong. Scott became even more angry and wanted to attack the knight, but Steve stopped him by putting his hand in front of him. Now Scott was angry with Steve too, because how dare he stop and point him out. The guy explained to the other that they would be doomed if they now went against the whole country, to which Howard shook his head affirmatively and said that Steve was well aware of their situation. However, this angered Scott even more, and he struck using his ability. A hot wave of flame began to approach the man at breakneck speed, ready to burn everything in its path. There was a huge explosion, and it seemed that this fire would definitely hurt anyone. The explosion gave way to a huge cloud of smoke and smoldering particles slowly falling to the ground, when suddenly Howard flew out of this smoke furiously, and aimed his blow right at the guy. The man's fist hit the guy's cheek with great force, so that he flew far away. Scott, stunned, fell to the ground and lost consciousness. The crowd stared at the guy in shock, because Scott was one of the strongest of them, and he was defeated so easily. With his actions, Howard decided to show what the young candidates are really worth, that is, nothing. And then, announcing that harsh training would begin tomorrow, he turned around and left the guys with Lillian. Soon Scott stood up. The guys tried to help him, but he pushed them away, not wanting to accept their pity. With hatred in his eyes and a smile on his face, he promised that he would definitely kill Howard. The next day after combat practice, the guys gathered in front of the White Gate, where Sam and Lillian were waiting for them. Sam explained that, by order of the saint, he would be the leader of their training today. The man asked if those who were injured in practice yesterday were okay. Meryl replied that she was fine and that Sarah's treatment had helped her a lot, and also pointed out one hot-tempered guy who is also fine. Scott snorted disdainfully at this. Afterwards, Sam said that today they would fight in his research center. Steve, having heard about this, decided to find out if this building was filled with monsters. Sam decided instead of answering that it would be faster to show them everything, and the gates began to open. The guys began to move deeper into the building, and on their sides there were cages with all possible monsters. Lillian said the research center is also used as a field training site for soldiers. Sam confirmed this and explained that it was very beneficial for him because he could gather a lot of data about the monsters based on the battles. The guys did not share the positive attitude of Lillian and Sam. They were rather frightened by the whole situation. The actual battles between the candidates and the monsters began, but Kyle, as usual, stood at the wall and watched. The guy noted that today the guys are surprisingly calm. Perhaps it's due to yesterday's experience. However, he also noticed that despite the great confidence, there was still fear in their movements. Roxy, who was fighting the monster at the moment, after a strong blow from the monster, fell onto the grass, only managing to cover her face with her hands. However, she quickly stood up and, rubbing the bruised area, was about to strike again. The monster, whose armor was slightly charred, prepared for the next blow, holding out his huge sword in front of him. Steve, who was watching the fight, began to worry a lot about his girlfriend and decided to ask Sam to stop the fight, but the scientist refused, saying that Lillian specifically asked to be stricter with the guys. Looking again at Roxy and the monster, he said that the guys still did not fully understand the state of things. The scientist said, looking at the girl who had already managed to get ready, that the hero candidates could never lose to such a weak monster. Muttering how much this monster pisses her off, Roxy raised her hand up, starting to collect a fireball in it. The fireball release reached the monster, and the fire engulfed the entire body, causing the monster to remain in agony. Seeing this, Steve was dumbfounded while the crowd cheered, and Sam replied that they were capable of this from the very beginning, only fear and hesitation held them back. Sam, surprised, asked that this was really the only problem. The scientist said that as the level of divine blessing increases, there is a chance to receive another blessing. Going down the stairs, Kyle turned to Steve and said that he had business with him. Turning around, the guy asked what was the matter, not at all expecting that Kyle would turn to him. Using his ability at half strength, which made only one eye glow red, the guy replied that he noticed that Steve had a new blessing. On the skill window, you could notice a new first-level deadly attack on a monster. Without wasting a second, the guy decidedly wanted to try out his new skill and asked to go into battle next. And so Steve entered the arena, where a monster stood in front of him, growling menacingly, and the guy began to activate his ability with a hissing sound. Steve activated his first ability, Sword that protects against evil, and his sword appeared in his hand, glowing with a blue light. And then he activated Deadly Attack on Monster, causing everything around to become filled with blue light. Unexpectedly, the monster did not swear to attack, but, on the contrary, seemed to be afraid of the guy, which surprised him. However, this did not stop the guy, and he decided to make a high-speed attack. The monster did not attack him in response, but only covered his face with his hands, trying to defend himself. An obvious panic was visible on his face. Furiously swinging his sword, Steve not only injured the monster, but was even able to cut off his hand, causing it to fly upward. But this was not the end of the battle, because the monster was still alive, and the guy struck again. And this time the monster lost its head, it hit the ground with force, and fear was now forever imprinted on the monster's face. The monster's body went limp and fell to the ground, and the crowd exploded with joyful and admiring screams. Kyle thought that with such strength, even the armored bear that he met yesterday in the forest would not become a problem, and also assumed that by training, he too could receive a new blessing. Suddenly, with the help of his ability, he noticed that Scott, who was laughing while sitting on the podium, also had a new blessing. From the window, Kyle could see that this new blessing turned out to be Blessing Mine. However, he decided not to tell the guy about this and turned away from him. Filled with the desire to become stronger after seeing the fight, Kyle also decided to become stronger, and therefore thought that he also needed training. At night, several guys gathered in Scott's room, who decided to share his plan with him. Ryan was wary of this plan and asked if he was really going to do this. With an angry look on his face, Scott replied that he was absolutely serious about the fact that he was going to first kill Howard, and then capture Lillian and beat out of her a way to return back to his world. Other guys picked up this idea, because they really wanted to return, and someone even suggested killing the Saints so that no one could call them again. Scott tried to convince Ryan to join them, because he knew that he was also not happy with the current state of affairs. The guy did not agree yet, he decided to first find out what the chances were that they would succeed, to which the other answered him that if Ryan joined them, they would increase much. Ryan really wanted to go back to his world, but he didn't want to kill someone to do it. But then he remembered how yesterday before his eyes the monster almost tore Meryl to pieces, and because of this he hesitated. And yet, breaking his convictions, he agreed. The next day, the guys trained again within the city walls, some in pairs, some alone. Steve was diligently practicing with his sword, not noticing anyone around. Kyle stood with his back against the tree and watched the guy. The guy, without much emotion, remarked out loud what seal the other had, and only then did Steve notice him. To which he replied with an awkward smile that he was still too weak, and therefore he needed to find a way to become stronger. But Kyle noticed that the guy was already able to defeat half of the knights of this kingdom, wondering why he called himself weak. Steve replied that he was unhappy that he was not yet able to defeat Howard, and therefore he needed even more power, and that he would not be satisfied until he could protect everyone. Kyle thought about it, but didn't answer anything, but asked what he thought about Lillian. Continuing to exercise, he replied that for her they were all just pawns that she used with knowledge, and that Howard had not lied about the fact that if they did not obey, they could be harmed. Kyle asked about the possibility that if the saint ordered, they would be sent to fight the demon king to the death without delay. The other answered with absolute confidence in his words that this was so, and everything had already been decided. But then he said that he was going to be the only one to fight him, and that he would defeat this demon king as the hero of this country. Steve said that in exchange for this he would try to negotiate a better life for everyone, to which Kyle replied that it was a good plan, but he was not sure that Lillian would agree to it. The swordsman replied that it was only for the sake of his plan and her recognition that he was swinging the sword. Suddenly, someone began to approach the guys, noting that today everyone gave their best. It was Lillian, accompanied by her knight. Sam happily went to the girl to greet his mistress. Lillian announced that while she and Howard were away, the hero candidates would remain in the scientist's care, to which Sam replied that the saint could rely on him. Roxy, hearing this, decided to clarify what "while they are gone" means, and whether this means that they are leaving somewhere. Lillian, with her ever-present smile on her face, replied that they were indeed leaving for a few days and that Sam would be their handler. After this announcement, the girl and the knight hastened to take their leave. A carriage is driving along the road, pulled by 2 horses, held by Howard, and suddenly he asks the saint if everything is okay. Under the measured sound of wheels, the saint asks what the man means. The knight calls on Lillian to stop making a fool of herself, because he and she know for sure that Scott is up to something. The girl replies, slowly sipping tea from a cup, that most likely he will try to rebel against them. Without taking his eyes off the road, the knight asks what she plans to do if all this suddenly happens. But Lillian replied, looking out the window, that she decided not to take any action, because she was curious what Scott would come up with. And Howard says that he doesn't mind, but the guy is still developing, and he is a hero candidate, albeit small, but there is a chance that they will unite. But the saint doesn't care much about this, and she replies that they still can't defeat her, that it's impossible. Howard, looking away from the road, squints in Lillian's direction and agrees with her, but he wants to say something else, when suddenly the girl asks if he thinks that this situation could be very beneficial for them. The saint says that she wanted to gradually show them their place in the world, but this uprising is an excellent excuse to break their claws. But then she remembers another dubious person and wonders whether she should be left alone. Kyle quickly runs away through the night forest from a lizard monster chasing him. Suddenly he pushes off the ground and flies into the air. From a height, with a sudden movement of his hand, he throws a knife, which hits the monster directly in the head. The monster falls dead to the ground, and Kyle, having landed and not taking out his sword, runs further, turning towards the monster's corpse. The guy notes that he was able to kill this monster in 13 seconds, and uses his new one to check if his performance has changed. However, there are no changes, except for the new skill blessing, display weaknesses. Noticing this, Kyle assumes that his level has increased since he killed the demon in the forest a couple of days ago, and now the question is how to put it into practice. Hearing a rustling sound, Kyle snaps out of his thoughts and turns around sharply, and he sees a huge pink monster flying at him with a fist, spraying saliva. The monster hits with his fist the place where the guy was standing, but the blow does not reach the target, but only leaves a mark on the ground. Kyle, who managed to dodge, ends up on the side of the monster. He takes out 3 small knives from his cloak and with a sharp movement of his hand throws them straight at the monster. However, the knives do not pierce the monster, but only bounce off the skin, leaving not a single trace, which angers the monster even more. Kyle felt panic when he noticed how hard the monster was, but quickly gathering his thoughts, he once again dodged the monster's blow, thinking that this monster was an ideal experimental subject for experiments. The guy activated his new ability display weak points, and suddenly the back of this monster's neck glowed with blue light. Then the guy pushed off the ground again and soared into the air. Finding himself behind the monster, he took out a knife, aiming exactly at the place where the axle was illuminated with blue light. The knife plunged into the monster's neck, from which blood was now flowing profusely, and the monster howled in pain. At the same time, Kyle landed, and the huge carcass of the monster fell to the ground dead. Looking at the monster's neck, the guy noticed that his ability pointed to the softest place of the monster's skin. Looking at his hand, Kyle noted that this is a good strength. However, this is not enough to survive in this world. The guy was filled with the desire to become even stronger. Suddenly, 3 small monsters with clubs ran out of the bushes with piercing screams. The guy used weakness display again, and the monster's forehead and part of the chest in the area of the heart glowed with a bright red light. In a quick movement, Kyle threw 3 knives, and these knives hit the hearts of 3 little monsters, throwing them back. The monsters fell to the ground dead, kicking up dust from the ground. Kyle, taking a knife from the chest of one of the monsters, noticed that, of course, the weak points of these monsters turned out to be their heart and brain, and noted that this new one was very useful against ordinary monsters. Kyle wondered if he should look for other types of monsters to test this ability of his. However, just as he was about to move out, he heard a man approaching him. From the bowl of the forest, hidden by the shadow of the trees, a dark figure was approaching, holding a glowing lantern in his left hand. Finally emerging from the shadows, Rosie could be seen illuminated by the moonlight, who immediately turned to Kyle. Kyle turned his head sharply and asked the girl what she was doing in the forest at such a late hour. Approaching closer to the guy, the girl replied that she walked around the hostel several times while looking for the guy, and also decided to check the forest, and was right. The guy sighed and replied that Rosie should quickly return to the dorm, because it is dangerous in the forest at night. The girl indignantly noted that it was worth telling her, because Kyle was the first to go into the forest. The guy replied that he was used to the restrictions of the night, but the girl was not, and besides, fighting monsters in pitch darkness is not so easy. But the girl did not want to listen to this any further and asked what the guy was doing here. Kyle answered seriously and honestly that he was experimenting with his new blessing. The girl, not believing what the guy was saying, asked again. The guy reminded the girl of what Sam had said earlier about blessings, namely that by increasing the level of blessing they could receive new blessings. Then Rosie asked what kind of blessing Kyle received. Kyle turned away from the girl, asking what was the point of telling him about this. This outraged the girl, and she said that she was worried in vain and came here. Turning around, the guy, with a slight smile on his face, asked that she was worried about him. The girl, stuttering, shouted with a reddened face that she didn't mean that. Not paying attention to this, Kyle turned his head back, saying that it was time for the girl to return, and he would still stay and experiment. Rosie answered resolutely that she would go with him, when suddenly she noticed something with her peripheral vision and turned her gaze to the side. It turned out that the girl noticed the smoke and wondered what was going on there, to which Kyle also noticed and turned his head. This smoke came from the dormitory building, which was completely engulfed in hot flames. The guys from the hostel in their pajamas ran out into the street, where they were met with threatening roars by hungry monsters. However, not everyone was far from the fire yet, so Sarah and another girl ran away from the fire. Suddenly, a huge red monster appeared right in front of the healer, opening its mouth wide in a threatening roar. But then a blue flash flashed by. It turned out it was Steve, who cut the monster and, holding the girl by the shoulder, held her back. The guy sympathetically asked the girl if she was okay. The girl quietly replied that she was fine and thanked the savior. Suddenly, 5 small monsters with clubs appeared in front of them, which Steve immediately noticed and put his hand in front of the girl. Taking his sword in his hands, the guy excitedly noticed that there was no end to them. Suddenly, with a loud crash, a huge wave of flame flew at these monsters, burning them alive. It turned out to be Roxy, irritably noting that this fire and monsters had disturbed her sweet dream, and she also wondered where these monsters came from. It turned out that Scott was standing behind her, who replied that it was not the time to ask these questions, but first they needed to deal with the monsters and the fire. Kyle and Rosie hurried to join the others. Seeing them, Ryan was relieved and said that he was very glad that no one was hurt. Kyle replied that they went out for a short walk and asked about what happened here. But Ryan himself did not know what happened here. He said that he just escaped from the fire and there was a horde of monsters. Then Kyle noticed that this was more similar to human methods, which means there must be a puppeteer somewhere nearby whom they must track down. His guess was confirmed by Sam, who suddenly appeared, taking the guys by surprise. The guy sat imposingly on the wall, putting one leg on it, while slowly burning particles flew around him. Looking at him carefully, he said that he had been wondering why there was a whole bunch of monsters here. However, if Sam was behind everything, it began to make sense, and that these monsters were from his research center. The scientist replied with a smile that Kyle was right, and noted that the monsters had to be strengthened with drugs so that they were suitable for his plan. The guy angrily asked the man about his purpose and benefits in killing hero candidates. Sam honestly answered that he received an order from above that he must destroy hero candidates even at the cost of his own position, but he personally does not hold a grudge against them, but they will have to die. Rosie asked in horror if this was an order from above. Could it really be an order from Lillian? However, the scientist, standing up, replied that Lillian, whom he called a fox, had nothing to do with this, and the order was given to him by the Demon King. Ryan, dumbfounded, asked if Sam was a spy for the Demon King's army. Then the scientist replied that if he succeeded in this attack, he would be able to continue his research. To which Kyle replied that he was too carried away with his research that he was even rotten to the very bones. Throwing up his hands, Sam triumphantly replied that he would not be able to understand the mysterious essence of monsters while he himself remained human. Numerous battles with monsters continued actively in front of the burning dormitory building. Sam triumphantly watched these battles with a guard of 2 monsters, and his cloak fluttered in the wind. The scientist, looking down with empty eyes but with a smile on his face, commanded the monsters to attack, and the monsters, obeying the command, rushed towards the guys. Kyle called out to Rosie, urging her to use her ability, which the girl understood and raised her hand, using her ability, ordering them to stop. The monsters, under the influence of the girl's ability, glowed pink and stopped. The girl, continuing to cast her spell, ordered the monsters to attack Sam. Hearing this command, Sam grinned, saying that it was a pathetic attempt, and ordered the monsters to wake up. Unexpectedly, the scientist's command worked, and the monsters were freed from the girl's control. Discouraged, Rosie exclaimed, not at all expecting such an outcome. The scientist with a radiant smile reminded him that he was a scientist, which means it would be strange if he didn't have a way to pacify the monsters when they start to riot. Now Sam commanded the monsters to attack, and they obediently rushed at the girl. Kyle, who was crouching behind the girl, took out a knife and told her to bend down. And then, with a quick dash, he killed 3 monsters, striking at their hearts. This sight stirred the scientist's twisted heart, and he burst into laughter, asking Kyle to give him even more sights. The rest of the monsters immediately attacked the guy. With a quick movement, the guy inflicted a deep wound on the chest in the area of the green monster's heart. With the next blow, he crouched sharply and plunged the knife into the head of the blue lizard monster. A huge red monster was about to attack him from behind, but Kyle noticed it and turned his head. Turning sharply, the guy raised his leg and hit the monster hard on the head. This blow stunned the monster, and it fell to the ground with a loud sound, throwing its head back. Having finished with that monster, Kyle looked sternly at the other monsters and stood in a stance, preparing to face a new battle. However, the monsters were not going to attack. They froze, looking fearfully at the powerful enemy. Sam asked in fear what is wrong with them, because this guy doesn't even have a really useful blessing. Kyle decided to use his ability on the scientist. When the skill window opened to the guy's eyes, he immediately noticed the slave witchcraft skill and realized that Rosie's ability didn't work because the monsters had received an order from a higher level. Since things didn't go according to plan, Sam decided to use his trump card, which he didn't want to use. Standing on the wall, he took out a whistle, and a loud, piercing whistle was heard. Kyle, not expecting what the scientist did, asked what he was up to. Sam replied with a smile on his face that the guy would soon understand everything. Preparing to attack, Kyle took a step forward and said that he would get rid of him faster, but he did not have time to finish his sentence. Suddenly he saw something unexpected in front of him. It turned out that a huge fireball was flying towards him, but the guy managed to dodge and the ball crashed into the ground. The guy jumped several meters away from the fireball. Suddenly, raising his head, he saw something he did not expect to see. There was a huge red dragon in the sky, preparing to release another fireball. With a loud roar, the dragon opened its mouth, preparing to attack again. Standing on the wall, Sam solemnly announced that this was the red dragon and his best trump card. The dragon, in comparison with which everything seemed small, lowered its gaze down, looking for a new target. Suddenly he jumped from the roof of the house, destroying the chimney, and fragments of this chimney flew down. Pieces of the chimney flew straight towards Kyle, Ryan and Rosie. In a second, Rosie realized that she would not be able to dodge this stone, and she froze in fear. But before the stone touched the girl, Kyle saved her by jumping away from that place, holding her close to him. Releasing the girl, he asked if she was okay, while preparing for a new attack by the dragon, which was in the sky and looking right at them. Kyle asked the same question to Ryan, who was standing behind, and then said that the next attack would be coming soon, and ordered the guy to take Rosie and leave. Flapping his wings, the dragon quickly flew down. The dragon appeared in front of the guys and Kyle screamed, getting its attention as Ryan quickly ran away with Rosie in his arms. The dragon roared furiously, raising its head and thereby opening its neck, where one place glowed with blue light. It turned out that it was Kyle who used his ability to find a weak point. The guy slashed at the dragon with his knives. However, his blow not only did not wound the monster, but also his knives shattered into small fragments. Suddenly Scott, standing on the roof of the house, exclaimed that such a giant was just for him, and, shouting for the dragon to die, and activating a new ability, Explosion, he delivered a powerful blow. This blow stunned the monster, and he raised his head, trying to recover, and Scott flew down with a perky smile. Upon reaching the ground, Scott looked at the dragon and exclaimed, mocking him. But his joy quickly ended, because something happened that scared the guy. The dragon, quickly coming to his senses, breathed fire directly at the guy with even greater fury, which is why he did not have time to dodge, but could only cover his face with his hands. Scott's clothes and hair caught fire, and he began rolling on the ground in an attempt to put out the fire. The guy managed to put out the fire, and he turned to Kyle, because with a sigh, he said that there was no point in relaxing. Getting to his feet, the guy turned to Scott to tell him his plan. Kyle said that together they could defeat this dragon, while the dragon was preparing for a new attack. Scott asked in a pretentious tone what use Kyle had to him. Kyle replied that he knew the dragon's weak points, however he needed Scott to get to them. To this the guy replied that he was not going to team up with a small weakling. Kyle did not respond to the other's statement, but only noted that the dragon was returning. Now the monster decided to strike with its tail, which swept away everything in its path. The guys were able to dodge the giant tail by jumping in time. Noticing that his attack was not successful, the dragon, with bubbling sounds, again began to concentrate the fire in its mouth. Scott, who had just avoided the tail attack, had no time to prepare for the dragon's next attack, and so the dragon again directs a wave of fire at the guy, from which he again does not have time to dodge. Having taken 2 attacks from the monster, the guy barely gets to his feet. Noticing this, Kyle teases the other, saying that if he is so confident in his abilities, then let him continue. In the end, Scott agrees and asks where he needs to hit. Kyle points him to the upside-down scales on the dragon's throat. The guy easily notices this diamond-shaped scale. Convinced that Scott has noticed her, he suggests that he distract the dragon, and he will hit the weak point, and then asks if everything is clear. The guy confidently replies that he understands everything and is in a hurry to start. Still standing on the wall, Sam urges the dragon on, asking him why he is hesitating, and then he desperately orders the dragon to quickly kill the guys. The dragon responds furiously to the order, opening its mouth wide. The dragon begins to take off, flapping its wings, thereby creating strong gusts of wind, and then, landing again, he growls furiously, opening his mouth wide and sticking out his tongue. Kyle is throwing knives again. Knives that fly into the dragon's face fly away without hurting it. Turning his attention to the guy, he turns on him as he runs away. The monster tries to grab the guy with his teeth, but he deftly dodges and runs on. Suddenly the guy stops, sliding along the ground. The dragon's neck ends up near the ground as Scott quickly runs towards it, and Kyle gives him the go-ahead. At speed, the guy falls to the ground and I drive right under the dragon's weak point. And then, using his ability, he strikes directly at the dragon's weak point. The charred dragon makes puzzled noises as its head falls down. The dragon loudly falls to the ground dead, and this causes fragments and crumbs to fly around. Sam watches all this, stunned. Not a trace of his former fun remains. Kicking the dragon's head, Scott taunts the monster, calling him a jerk. Kyle teases the guy for saying this even though he can barely stand, to which the other tells him to shut up. Looking up, Kyle asks the scientist what he will do now without his trump card. Sam, looking around in panic, replies that he still has a bunch of monsters down there. However, looking down he saw that all the other monsters were dead. Steve says that they killed everyone else, and the guys glare at the scientist, preparing to attack him. Sam takes a step back in panic, intending to escape. However, Ryan appears from behind, flying up to him with the help of his wind power. Taking a step back again, the man stumbles, and starts flying down the wall. But before he hits the ground, he falls into a water ball, which stops his fall. Sam emerges from it. Opening his eyes, the first thing he sees is a knife pointed at him. It turns out to be Kyle, who says that he started the battle in the middle of the night, but took it too long, and he has a lot of questions. The scientist, in a panic, asks the guy not to kill him and expresses his readiness to answer all questions. But then the man begins to experience incredible pain. His eyes change color to purple. A second later, Sam falls dead, his face turning purple and bleeding from his eyes. Kyle reports that the scientist died, and Steve asks what it was, to which the guy replies that perhaps it was some kind of curse technique. Steve then concludes that this curse killed Sam after he promised to tell everything. Kyle says that most likely the threat from the army of the Demon King in their direction will only grow. The next day the knights went to inspect the scene. Lillian, who has already returned, covering her mouth with her hand, says that she cannot believe that this happened in their absence. Pointing his finger at the saint, Ryan is indignant, because it was she who entrusted them to Sam, which means she should have at least suspected something. In response to this, Lillian smiles slyly, covering her lips with her hand, and then he notices that apparently there was a misunderstanding. The saint laughs and says that she wanted to say that she did not expect the monster Lord Sam to do so much damage. The guys are stunned by this statement. Roxy angrily clarifies, asking if she really knew everything from the very beginning, but did nothing. To which Lillian replies that she was talking about toughening up their training, and this is just the beginning. One guy exclaims that they could all have died, because Sam set the dorm on fire while most were asleep. Howard responds to this by telling him not to whine and not to let his guard down even at night, otherwise they will die instantly. Kyle notes in his thoughts that even he did not have time to notice that horde in time, and asking schoolchildren to do this is real madness. Lillian decides to talk about the main topic and reports that the guys are going to the capital. Steve, confused, asks why they need to go there. The saint replies that hero candidates are the main topic of discussion in the country, and that a parade will be held in their honor, and the people will be pleased to see the heroes of the occasion. After long hours of travel, when night had already fallen, Howard announced that it was time to take a break, and they would move on at dawn. The guys set up camp, set up tents and lit fires, sitting several people around one fire. Sitting by the fire, Scott noticed that there were 30 people here and tore off a piece of dried meat with his teeth. Two other guys did not understand what he was talking about. Then the guy explained to them that they were guarded by 30 people. He noticed that there was no one serious among them. One of the guys says Scott would have done them in one hit, and asks if he's up to something. The guy replies that this is a great chance for their plan. The other guy hesitantly agrees. The guys notice that there are usually more people around them, and they are also weaker than them. Biting harder into the meat, Scott also notices that these patrolmen don't care about them, so they don't even suspect that the guys are going to start a riot. The guy takes a sharp bite of meat and says that today they will definitely run away, and orders the guys to call Ryan and the others. It turns out that Kyle was standing by the tent all this time and eavesdropping. Kyle agrees that they don't have many soldiers assigned to them, and they are all weak. But he is sure that the reason for this is that Lillian and Howard are confident in their abilities, and the guy needs more time to understand them. Kyle approaches Steve, who is sitting near the fire, and calls out to him, to which he turns. The guy asks him to give him a minute. Everyone had already gone to their tents, in which the lights were now on. Only the guards remained on the street. Meanwhile, Scott and his team hid in the forest. Scott checks with the guys to see if everyone except the guards has fallen asleep. Ryan replies that it looks like it. Suddenly, right in front of the guys, Steve and his team appear. Coming closer, the guy asks if it is true that Scott plans to kill Lillian and all the soldiers. In response, Scott asks who told him about this. Steve replies that she heard it herself when she walked past his tent. Roxy says she doesn't like them herself, but killing them is crazy. Scott replies that they are the only ones who are crazy and asks how long they intend to follow Lillian's lead. Steve says that he understands the guy's feelings perfectly, but there must be another way, because murder is not the answer. The rebel asks what the guy's plan is, to which he replies that he is going to become Lillian's pawn and defeat the Demon King, and in return he will ask to provide everyone else with safety and housing. Scott doubts that the saint will agree to this, but Steve assures him that if he gets stronger, she will have to listen to him. The rebel, spitting to the side, rejects the guy's plan and defense and tells him to get out of his way, because he's heading back to his home world. Then Steve says that since the guy is so serious, they will have to stop him. Scott's team prepares to take the fight. The rebel hits Steve in the face with his knee, but the guy manages to cover his face with his hands. This blow sent Steve flying several meters away. The guy was surprised by the strength and speed of the enemy. Scott was surprised that the guy was able to block his blow. While the guys were amazed at each other's strength, two guards came running to the sounds of their battle and asked what they were doing here. Scott was afraid that Steve would tell everything about the riot, but the guy only replied that they were just having a small quarrel. Hearing this, the guards turned around and, telling them to go to bed, because it was already late, left. Scott also turned around and said that this is all boring. The guy angrily stated that he was annoyed by the softness of the other. The next day the guys arrived in the capital of Dominica. Ryan, admiringly looking at everything that surrounded him, exclaimed how amazing it all was. Merle quietly said that her capital is annoying, because there are so many people here. But then Roxy noticed that things weren't as bad here as in Tokyo, to which the other girl just laughed. The carriage drove slowly along the main street, followed by the guys, surrounded by guards. Howard suddenly shouted to the crowd to disperse, because a saint and a group of hero candidates were coming. The crowd obediently dispersed, letting the guests through, and people, surprised by this, not believing their eyes, asked whether these were really those chosen by God himself. The crowd joyfully greeted the hero candidates. Steve decided to greet them back by raising his hand. Scott and his two friends were only irritated by such attention and the crowd, and they looked around angrily. Kyle noted that it turned out they were not lying when they said that the townspeople were relying on them, to which Rosie replied that this made it creepy. When the candidates arrived at the castle, they were met by the holy knight Wright and, having greeted them, he sent the guests to rest. The boys went to their bedrooms, where they found very soft beds, which were especially soft after sleeping on the ground. Afterwards they went to bathe in the hot springs, and then they all got plenty to eat. However, Steve decided to put aside rest and all the comforts, and instead returned to training. Kyle also decided to postpone his vacation, and instead decided to gather information. While moving around the castle, he noted a large number of guards, which made moving around the castle much more difficult. Continuing to explore the castle, the guy looked through one window and noticed someone. This someone turned out to be the already familiar Knight Wright, who was talking about something with the guards. Kyle decided to stalk up behind a tree and listen to what they were talking about. One of the guards asked about the candidates, to which the knight replied that they were now resting in the guest rooms. The same guard asked whether these guys had really been chosen by God, to which the man replied that they had powers that ordinary children should not have, so it must be true. The guard asked if Wright was worried about the possibility of action from the believers in the Demon King, because by inviting candidates they could provoke them. Another guard notes that they have indeed been seen acting suspiciously lately, so they should be more careful. While hiding behind the bushes, Kyle heard about Demon King believers, which raised questions in his mind. Wright responded that since they were hero candidates, they shouldn't worry about these believers. Remembering that training will begin soon, the knight and his guards leave. Kyle became curious to know more about these Demon King believers, so he decided to go out into the city to ask people about them. In the evening, the bar is crowded as usual, and therefore noisy, and smells strongly of alcohol. After placing a coin on the counter, someone asks the shopkeeper to pour him a glass of ale. This someone turns out to be Kyle, who decided to find out more about the affairs in the capital in a bar. drunk visitors are loudly discussing the newly arrived hero candidates. Someone says that they are too skinny, to which another replies that they were chosen by the saint herself, and therefore there is no point in chatting, because if the church finds out, they will definitely be punished. Kyle notes that apparently the church has enormous influence in this world, because the common people fear it more than the king or aristocrats. The shopkeeper, with a loud knock that sends drops flying, places a brimming mug of alcohol in front of the guy. Posing as a traveling companion who knows nothing of local customs, Kyle asks the shopkeeper to answer a few questions. The guy asks about who the Demon King believers are that they talk about on every corner here. In response to this question, scratching his ear with his little finger, the man asks if the guy knows that the country is now at war with the army of the Demon King, and the man says that the king of the demons who controls this army seems to many to be an almighty monster, so among the people there were those who admire and worship his power. The shopkeeper continues that these same believers are now rampant throughout the country, and recently they even blew up several aristocratic houses. Kyle replies that this all sounds like a serious problem, and in his thoughts he compares them to terrorists. Leaving the bar, the guy walks through the city at night. The guy notices that everyone here believes that only candidates for heroes are able to defeat the Demon King, and that the believers hiding in the capital may very soon begin to act, which worries the people. Suddenly, Kyle is called out by Rosie, who has suddenly appeared among the crowd. Running up to him, she asks him where he has been all this time. Turning away from the girl, the guy says that they don't know anything about the capital, so he decided to collect information. In response, Rosie was indignant, saying that she understood everything, but you couldn't act alone, because it was dangerous, and she declares that if he asked, she would be glad to help him. Kyle, not at all touched by this, turns around and says that he can handle everything himself, and the girl is better off keeping in class, to which she is indignant and shouts after him that she doesn't understand why he behaves this way, because she can help. Resigned, the guy answers with a sigh that she can really help him with something, namely help him collect as much information as possible. I'll ask around the townspeople. Rosie, in turn, hearing this, agrees with joyful enthusiasm, and then, humming something under his breath, he leaves and disappears into the crowd. But then it turns out that there was a person in the crowd who had been eavesdropping on their conversation all this time. Kyle returned to his room through the window, and concluded that in the end he did not learn anything useful, but what he learned about their enemy was enough. Suddenly Kyle hears something suspicious. Leaning against the door, he notes that for some reason the guys are making noise in the middle of the night. Leaving his room, he notices that all his classmates have gathered there. After asking what's going on here, Kyle is told that they can't find Rosie anywhere. One of the girls replies that Rosie's roommate noticed that she hasn't returned yet, which is why they are looking for the girl. Kyle notes that he was also gone for a long time, but since he lives alone, they might not have noticed, and all he says out loud is that this whole situation makes him worry. Steve asks the guy if he knows something. Kyle replies that he doesn't know anything because he's been sleeping in his room all this time. Turning to the others, Steve says that they know for sure that she is not in the castle, so since it will soon get dark, they should look for her outside. Roxy states that Rosie can handle it on her own, but still agrees with the guy. Kyle notes that it is already late at night, which means that everyone in town has been asleep for a long time. In an attempt to find Rosie, the guy returns to the place where they last saw each other. Looking around, he tries to find at least something that could hint where the girl is now. Suddenly he notices something on the ground. The guy picks up the item, and it turns out to be Rosie's student card. While Kyle is looking at his student card, someone in a dark raincoat, walking along the same street, bumps into a guy. Suddenly the guy is attacked from all sides, armed with swords, by people in dark cloaks. Kyle skillfully fends off one of the attackers with a knife. Out of the corner of his eye, the guy notices someone approaching from the side and turns sharply, grabbing him by the arm, which the enemy did not expect. Kyle pulls the hand with the sword towards him by the wrist. With this action, he pierces the chest of another guy who tried to get up behind him. He roundhouse kicks the fourth attacker in the face, and after he fell to the ground, he stomps on his head, which greatly frightens the other guy who was earlier about to attack. Noting that these guys are only amateurs both in wielding a sword and in the ability to hide themselves. Using his ability, Kyle learns that the attackers are ordinary people without blessings or special skills and asks what they are trying to achieve. Turning to the remaining guy, he begins to approach him, causing him to squeal in fear. The guy, squinting his eyes, threatens to have the remaining guy tell him everything. While Kyle deals with the guys who attacked him, Rosie, meanwhile, is in some kind of dungeon, and her hands are immobilized by shackles. The girl looks angrily at her captors. In response to this, the kidnappers just grin. Rosie confidently tells them to interrogate as much as they want, because the answer will be the same. She won't tell them anything. The kidnappers respond that they just want to learn a little about the hero candidates. Suddenly one of the guys grabs the girl's blouse and tears it in the chest area. This causes the girl's breasts and her underwear to become exposed, which confuses her greatly, and the kidnappers only mock her, saying that she won't be able to remain silent for long. While one of the guys is laughing, Kyle is watching him from behind a pillar, testing him with his ability. Having used his ability, the guy notes that the guys are only amateurs, and therefore it's hard to believe that they were able to grab Rosie. Suddenly 2 knives fly out from behind a column. These 2 knives dig into the boys' temples, immediately killing them. Rosie's kidnappers fell dead right in front of the girl's feet. From somewhere off to the side, Kyle asks the girl if she's okay, and Rosie turns her head towards the sound of the voice. The guy comes out of his hiding place and, coming closer to the girl, checks to see if there are any more enemies nearby. Coming closer to the girl, he takes out the key and begins to open the shackles. At the same time, the girl wants to explain herself, but the guy shuts her up and says that it's time for them to leave. Once free, Kyle crouches down, looking at something on the floor, while the girl thanks him by rubbing her wrists. Suddenly the guy notices something and stands up, looking menacingly into the distance. Purple smoke begins to spread throughout the room, creeping along the floor. Suddenly, out of this haze, someone attacks the guys with great speed. The stranger strikes with his sword at the place where the guys stood a second ago, but the blow falls only on the stone floor, which crumbles from this blow. Kyle, having picked up Rosie, dodges the blow by jumping to the side. It turns out that the attacker on the guys is the Holy Knight Right, who is quite surprised that the guys were able to evade his blow, and therefore should not be left alive. The guy with the girl in his arms recognizes their new acquaintance as the attacker. The knight menacingly replies that he is also the head of the Demon King's church. Kyle is preparing for a new attack and holds a knife in front of him, saying that since the enemy has gotten so close to the top, this country won't have long left. Wright responds that by killing all the hero candidates, they will hasten the day of destruction. The guys are preparing for the next attack, standing a couple of meters from each other. Kyle decides to use his ability, and his eyes glow red, and a window of skills appears in front of the knight, and the guy notes that all his indicators are at an average level, which makes him universal, which means he cannot let down his guard. Wright jumps up and swings his sword at Kyle. He dodges again, and again the blow falls only on the stone floor. Suddenly the man puts out his hand in front of him, from which some kind of red seal appears, and he casts a fire spell. The red seal grows in size and many fireballs begin to fly out of it. The guy dodges again, quickly jumping up. But the knight was just waiting for the guy to jump, because now he wouldn't be able to dodge. Kyle, with a sharp movement of his hand, threw the knife at the man. Right, looking at the guy with his icy eyes, said that it was useless. The man shouted the spell again, and now instead of fireballs, his sword was covered in fire. Wright prepared to attack with his flaming sword, declaring that this was the end for the guy. But suddenly Kyle took out a pistol from his cloak and shot at the enemy. The bullet hit the knight right in the forehead. His eyes widened in surprise. Throwing his head back, the man fell to the ground with a loud sound, his eyes rolling back and blood pouring from his mouth. Putting the pistol back into his coat, Kyle complained that he had to use the pistol, because the number of cartridges was limited. Looking at the enemy's corpse, the guy admitted that the jump was a bad move, and he needed to hone his melee skills if he wanted to survive. Rosie, who had been hiding behind the column all this time, came out and asked in surprise about the gun. Kyle replied that he was a killer, so it was only natural that he would have one. To which Rosie replied that it was a little scary when you thought that her classmate had a gun with him all the time. Blushing a little, Rosie thanked the guy and asked that he had come to save her. Looking at the girl, the guy replied that it was just a coincidence, and asked why the girl didn't use her ability. The girl replied that those shackles did not allow her to use her powers, but now that they are not on her hands, everything is fine. Noting that there were such tools in this world, Kyle picked up Rosie's cloak from the floor. Turning around, the guy threw the cloak over the girl's shoulders and said that it was time for them to go. Turning around, Rosie said that these people were going to attack their classmates. The guy replied that he also heard about it, because the guy who tried to drag him here told everything. Then, at the place where Kyle was attacked by several believers, the remaining guy asked not to kill him. Kyle, running his finger along the blade of the knife, replied that it all depends on how he behaves. Kneeling, the believer replied that he was only following orders and that the hero candidates were insulting the demon king with their existence, and therefore should kill everyone. With a knife to his throat, Kyle asked if they had killed Rosie. In a panic, the guy replied that the girl they wanted to use as a hostage during the attack on the others was still alive. It was already beginning to get light, and the guys had finally left that dungeon and were now walking down the street. Kyle noticed that the believers who told the story, unlike Sam, were not silenced by the curse, which means the demons do not cooperate with them. Rosie concluded that these believers were just a group of fanatics, upset, and said that she thought that the people in this world were their allies. Looking at the girl, the guy said with a sigh that she would have let herself be deceived more, and also that those guys were able to put shackles on her because the girl had let her guard down. Confused, Rosie was indignant, saying that they were very polite when she asked them questions, to which Kyle asked if she didn't think it was suspicious, and concluded that their enemies were demons, but they couldn't rely too much on people either. Turning away, Rosie mockingly said that she was sorry for being so naive. Suddenly someone called out to the guys. It turned out that there was Steve, who was running towards them, waving his hand. Running up to them, he said that he was very glad that they were safe, and Rosie responded by apologizing that they had made everyone worry. The guy replied that the main thing was that they weren't hurt, and asked Kyle if he saved the girl. The guy replied that it was and said that he needed to talk to Steve about something important. Steve concluded out loud that something had happened. Kyle told the guy about the Church of the Demon King, whose members believe in the omnipotence of the Demon King and help him get rid of people, and that now their main goal is hero candidates. Steve noted that, unlike monsters, it would be difficult to identify opponents if they were people. Kyle replied that they needed to warn the others. The swordsman suggested telling Lillian about this, because extra guards wouldn't hurt them. Rosie noted that even if they told the saint, she would only tell the guys to deal with it themselves. But the guy replied that, be that as it may, now they need to gather the others and decide what to do, because they are now looking for Rosie throughout the city. Suddenly there was a loud sound that made the girl scream. It turns out that an explosion occurred somewhere nearby, and now a column of smoke is visible in the air. At the same moment, someone ran up to the guys. It turned out that these were believers who now surrounded the guys. Steve wondered if they were attacking the points where the Rosie search teams were located. Getting ready to face the attack, Kyle said that the enemies were approaching and the guys should get ready. In fact, the enemy also surrounded other search groups. Kyle decided to use his ability again and noticed that the 6 attackers had much weaker skills than Right. Suddenly, the believers simultaneously jumped up and began to attack the guys, who stood with their backs to each other. Extending her hand, Rosie used her ability, Control, and a pink light flew from her hands straight towards her enemies. The attackers, engulfed in this pink light, lost control of their bodies, which scared them. Kyle threw several knives with a sharp movement of his hand. These knives hit the attackers directly in the heads, causing them to die immediately. Steve told Kyle that believers are only people, not monsters. But the guy, frowning and looking at the other, replied that it didn't matter, because the main thing was that now they were their enemies. Steve tried to object, but Kyle noticed that while he was talking, another one appeared. This yet another enemy decided to attack Steve from behind, but the guy managed to turn around in time and, cursing, blocked the blow of the sword with his sword. And then he angrily asked why they were doing this, namely, behaving like monsters, because they are the same people. The attacker replied with a smile on his face that they were doing all this for the sake of their master. Rosie, noticing that Steve was attacked, wanted to use her power, but Kyle stopped her by putting his hand in front of her, which surprised the girl. Kyle explained that he stopped her because it was time for Steve to stop being such a softer. Swinging his sword, Steve cut through the believer's sword. The guy said that he would let the believer go if he put down the sword, but shouting that he should not mock him, he only became even more incensed and attacked the guy again. Since Steve was not prepared for this attack, the attacker was able to injure him, and then the man laughed loudly, and the guy cursed quietly. Swinging his sword, Steve delivered a powerful blow to the believer's chest. The man then fell to the ground, dropping the rest of his sword as a pool of blood pooled beneath him. But the wounded man did not give up, but wanted to continue, but could not get up. Kyle approached and told Steve to finish off the almost dead believer. The guy tried to argue that there was no point in this, because he would already die soon. Looking sternly at the guy, the other replied that he would not necessarily die, but that he needed, if possible, to eliminate all possible obstacles. Steve was frightened by the fact that Kyle was so calm, because the wounded man was the same person as them, to which the guy objected that it was all just a matter of choice. He could kill him now, or he could leave him and wait until he attacked someone else. Kyle asked if the strongest guy in their class needed help, causing Steve to frown. The guy asked the swordsman whether the life of some stranger was more important to him than the lives of his classmates. Realizing everything, Steve decided to kill the remaining believer, and with the help of his magic sword he struck, causing blood to flow like a fountain from the wound. And after that, turning to the guys, he told them to go and help the others. Elsewhere, almost all of the attackers were already lying on the ground. It was unclear whether they were dead or unconscious. Scott held the last believer by the neck, lifting him off the ground, and using his ability, he struck straight into the man's chest. From this blow, the charred believer fell to the ground dead. Finishing off the rest of the believers, the other guys noticed what Scott had done and expressed their admiration. The other team was also doing well. At the moment, someone was running at high speed in front of the believers. It was Roxy with her hand outstretched and shooting fire out of her hand. The attackers became engulfed in flames and screamed in pain. A little out of breath, the girl complained that there were a lot of believers. Turning to the other girls, she irritably asked why they didn't help in any way, although they knew how to fight, and said that they could fight at least one-on-one. The other girls did not want to hurt the believers, because they were the same people. To this, an irritated Roxy replied that if they don't kill them, then I will kill them. The next second, one of the believers kicked one of the girls in the back, and the other struck with a sword at another girl, laughing evilly. Suddenly Lillian appeared on the horizon, asking how she should evaluate their preparation. Not expecting anyone else to appear, the attackers turned around in confusion. One of the believers, recognizing the newly arrived girl as a saint, attacked her with a scream. The girl, with a constant smile on her face, said that the hero candidates are under her command, so there is nothing strange in the fact that she helps them in times of danger. Another believer shouted that she was going to save the guys without having a single knight with her, which means she was mocking them. Laughing quietly, Lillian replied that they were just a group of amateurs fascinated by the power of the Demon King, which means they were not her opponents. The believer furiously shouted at the saint to shut up and rushed at her. Following him, all the believers rushed at Lillian with swords while she stood calmly. Suddenly she said something, and all the believers who were about to attack her found themselves firmly pressed to the ground by the golden glow. Roxy noted that this power was similar to Rosie's ability. Slowly walking through the crowd of worshippers pinned to the ground, unable to move, Lillian replied that she did not want them to compare her strength to something like that. While the entire area was engulfed in golden light, the girl continued to talk about how her ability was superior in strength and area of effect to Rosie's, that her enslavement technique was superior in all aspects. Roxy decided to ask the saint why she decided to help them. Chuckling, Lillian replied that she wished they could handle this situation themselves, because she was assessing their preparation. The girl replies that then they should thank the saint. To this the saint replies that there is no need to thank her, because her duties include training and guiding her subordinates. Suddenly one of the believers was able to move a little and grabbed Lillian by the hem of her dress. The man tells the saint not to dare ignore them and asks what will happen to them. Turning to the believer, she replies that she forgot that they are still alive, and turning to the girls, asks them to kill the believers. Suddenly, a golden light envelopes the girls, and they begin to pick up weapons until the body obeys them. The girl's hands with the sword rise above her head with the intention of piercing the immobilized believer lying nearby, while she screams and begs to stop. But still she cannot resist in any way and pierces the chest of the lying believer, killing him. Kyle and Rosie are watching everything happening from the roof. They see that while Lillian stands calmly, the girls around her, under her influence, are killing all the believers. The guy is surprised by the power of the third-level enslavement technique. The girl notices that this technique is several times stronger than her ability, because it can force a whole crowd of people to obey. Kyle decides that they urgently need to find a way to deal with this saint's ability. Half a day had passed since the attack by the believers. Evening came, and all the guys gathered in the castle. Running up to Roxy, Meryl asks what is going on with the other girls, to which the first one just shakes her head. Roxy replies that they are still not very good, because they still had to experience a strong shock. Ryan is outraged, saying that he will never forgive Lillian, because she controlled them like puppets and killed people with her hands, and that all of this is wrong. Turning to the girl, he asks her how she feels, because she, after all, was also controlled. The girl replies that she doesn't care that she was controlled, but she's annoyed because not everyone is as resilient as she is. Clenching his fist, Steve, squinting his eyes, says with annoyance that it's all his fault because he didn't have time. The other guys say that it's not the guy's fault, and besides, he saved them. Rosie regrets that they arrived too late, and did not have time to stop the saint. Kyle replies that even if they had arrived earlier, everything would have ended the same, because now they are not Lillian's opponents. The guy remembers that after he and Steve were separated, they managed to save a couple of groups, but they did not have time to get to Roxy's group. The guy concludes that the cult of the Demon King will not leave them soon, but he killed their leader, right? Which means they will calm down for a while. Kyle calls out to Rosie, who turns around. Leaving the hall, he invites the girl to talk a little. Kyle moves further and further away from the hall, where the guys are still there, and Rosie wakes him up. The girl asks what the guy is up to which he replies that in order to be able to resist Lillian's enslaving technique, he will need the help of someone with similar power, that is, the help of Rosie. Clearing her throat, the girl replies that since that's the only problem, she doesn't see any problems and is ready to help, and then asks what exactly is required of her. Kyle replies that he wants the girl to use her control on him and points a finger at himself. Such a request surprises and confuses the girl, and she screams in misunderstanding. The day after the victory over the Demon King sect, the people thanked the guys, and the people also saw how strong they were, and a grand parade was organized in honor of the appearance of hero candidates. Kyle wondered if Lillian could have planned this all in advance. Looking at the saint, he suggested that if this was all really part of her plan, then she was extremely dangerous. After passing through the streets of the city, the procession stopped at the gates to the city, where they now lined up in front of Lillian and Howard. After checking that everything was assembled, the girl announced that now they could all return back to the temple city of Athens. Rosie asked incomprehensibly about this city, to which Kyle replied that this is the city to which they were called, and apparently this city is subordinate to Lillian. Steve asked the saint that since she said so, it means that she will not return with them. The girl replied that she still needed to deal with the consequences of the recent incident, and Howard would accompany her. Roxy jokingly noted that they had nowhere to go back to since their dorm was also burned down. Turning to her friends, she asked if they were all right, because they could barely stand and were very distant. As if breaking from a trance, one of the girls answered hesitantly that she was fine, although judging by her face, everything was clearly not fine. Suddenly Lillian appeared in front of the girl's face, asking if something had happened. This is why the already frightened girl became even more frightened and took a step back from the saint, but lost her balance and began to fall. But Roxy, who managed to run up, caught her friend by the shoulders in time, and she did not fall. Turning around, the saint said that since nothing terrible had happened, she would leave them. However, Roxy wanted to object, but then the exhausted girl, almost lying on the ground, took her friend's hand and said that there was no need and that everything was fine. Heading into town, Lillian replied that it was nice and said goodbye, saying that they would see each other soon. After waiting a little, Howard ordered the guys to move out. After traveling for half a day, the guys decided to set up camp. They set up tents and lit fires. Meanwhile, Scott, who had not abandoned his idea, and his team went into the forest. Kyle was sitting near the fire at that time and, a little later, noticed that everything was ready. Turning her head towards the forest, Rosie is surprised to notice that the guys really decided to do this. Kyle notes that Lillian is not around. There are only 30 people accompanying her, and compared to the candidates they are weak. And if this is so, then this is the perfect chance to kill Howard, and the guy has no reason to stop this spectacle. Ryan and Howard walk through the forest, looking for a dragon-like monster. The guy turns his head, wondering where the monster went. Howard seriously says that they are nearby on the road leading to the capital, which means that if a dragon lives here, then many may get hurt, and they need to immediately report this to the Tamer's squad. Suddenly the guy shouts and points his finger at something, and Howard instantly reacts, being ready to draw his sword. But then suddenly Scott appears behind the knight. An explosion thunders. Ryan, who escaped the explosion by using his power to fly off, says it was dangerous. Howard tried to avoid the explosion by running away from it and holding his hands out in front of him. However, the explosion still hits him, and he has to hold on to a tree to keep from falling while blood runs down his face. Shaking off the dust, Scott said, coming closer to the knight, that he hit the owls with this force, but the man still did not die. The guy wanted to say something else and pointed his finger at the knight. This scared Howard and quickly jumped away from the guy. But that's what the guy wanted, because when the man jumped away, he stepped on a certain piece of ground, which made a clicking sound. After this clicking sound, an explosion occurred again, and now the man found himself in the very center of it and could not escape. Scott, mockingly, reminded them that they themselves had brought him here, and the guy knew for sure that setting traps would not be amiss. After this explosion, Howard's clothes warmed up a little, and he himself could no longer stand on his own, and he could only kneel, leaning on his sword. Since the knight had not yet died, Scott assumed that he had protected himself with the help of a blessing, but the wounds were still serious. Howard said that such a sudden attack was nothing more than a sign of cowardice, and he had a better opinion of the guy. However, the guy didn't care about honor. The main thing was that it could help kill a man. Scott's accomplices came out from behind the bushes and surrounded Howard, preparing to attack if anything happened. After a while, the knight finally pulled himself together and stood up, and put his sword in front of him, preparing to defend himself. In response to this, Scott ordered the guys to attack and not spare the man at all, because at any cost they must kill him. Saying that he had to stop this, Howard began to look for something in the pocket of his clothes. Suddenly he raised his hand, and a small blue ball flew out. At the same moment, the ball exploded in the sky like fireworks. Noticing these fireworks, Kyle noted that Scott possessed me. The guards also noticed the same fireworks, and, as it turned out, it was a distress signal. One guard noticed that Howard had not been seen for a long time, and another suggested that he had been attacked. The third guard said that it was not all that important, but that they should rather run to the signal. When suddenly someone struck a blow to the guard's neck, from which blood poured out. It turned out that it was Kyle. In his hands he was holding a knife, which was now bloody. The other guards did not expect the guy to appear, much less expect that someone would kill that guard. Suddenly, with a quick movement, Kyle approached another guard and put a knife to his throat. Having said that there was nothing personal in all this, but the guard must die, the guy cut his throat. He stuffed the knife right into the third guard's jaw, causing him to open his eyes wide, and then he knocked that guard onto the next one. The guards were perplexed why the hero candidate began to kill guards en masse. But before he could finish speaking, Kyle again noted that it was nothing personal, and he struck again, and then again and again, killing all the guards. Meanwhile, Howard was still surrounded by candidates. With loud screams, two guys began to attack the knight. But before they touched him in any way, the man was able to block both blows, one blow with a sword, and the other blow with his hand. Meanwhile, Ryan decided to strike, and using his ability, he made a wind spear, which he launched at Howard. Meanwhile, the other guy activated a support technique, which was enhanced by Ryan's wind spear. However, the man managed to react and jumped away from the place where the spear pierced a second later. But the attacks did not stop, and now another guy attacked the knight from the side, swinging at him with both hands. Howard, noting that it was weak, decided to parry the blow with his sword. But everything turned out to be not so simple, because instead of skin and flesh, the sword encountered steel, into which the guy turned his hands with the help of a blessing. Exclaiming about what inconvenient blessings the guys had, he jumped back, holding his now cracked sword in his hands. But Scott was waiting for him, who immediately struck again, and again, right in front of Howard's face, which he only managed to cover with his hands. An explosion thundered. This explosion strongly pushed the man away, forcing him to walk a couple of meters on his feet, raising dust. It turned out that this explosion not only stunned Howard, making him need to lean on his sword to avoid falling, but also tore off his left arm. Surprised by the resilience, Scott turned to the man, telling him how resilient he was. Suddenly Ryan flew up to the guy and noticed that those fireworks were a signal for help, and therefore he would try to gain time. In response, the knight said that this no longer makes sense. Suddenly Lillian appeared on the battlefield, saying that it looked like the guys had driven Howard into a corner. Meanwhile, in the camp, several guards lay tied up on the ground. Steve and the others found these guards and wondered what was going on. It turns out that this was the work of Rosie, who, using her ability, forced the guards to tie each other up. Sighing, Rosie said she was only following orders. Roxy stated that she was sure that the girl was not one to follow other people's orders. Suddenly Cal came out to them and, apologizing to Steve, said that it was he who gave the order to Rosie. The girl told the guy that she had caught about 7 people, but several escaped, to which the guy replied that there was no need to worry, because he had already taken care of the rest. Excited, Steve decided to clarify what taken care meant, in response to which Kyle honestly said that he had killed them, and the last soldiers were lying on the ground. Rosie was surprised to note that the guy was merciless as always. Steve asked the guy why he did this, to which the other replied that he decided to take care of the guards because Scott and his team were now busy fighting Howard. Gritting his teeth, the swordsman finally understood why he hadn't seen Scott anywhere. Roxy asked if the guys really weren't joking about this riot. Pointing to the guards lying on the ground, Kyle asked if she still had doubts, because these soldiers were sufficient proof. Steve asked the guy if he had joined Scott, because he thought that he was on his side, to which the guy replied that he was on his side. However, Kyle decided to remind Steve about Scott, asking if he was a priority right now while Scott was there trying to kill Howard. The swordsman, cursing, said that they would talk about this later and went to the rebels. Meanwhile, Lillian slowly approached Howard, noting that he was backed into a corner. The knight admitted that old age is taking its toll. Still high, Ryan asked Scott in a panic what they should do now. The guy replied that they would do what was necessary, because there was no other choice, and asked if the guys were really going to run away like cowards. The guys doubted that they should continue this battle, because the saint could control them. Lillian replied that they were right, although her ability has some limitations, so the stronger the enemy, the less her ability will affect him. However, the saint said that the guys with their blessing are only children in comparison with her miraculous power, which means she can control them all at once without any problems. In response to this, Scott called her a coward and said that if she fought them honestly, she would definitely lose. Lillian noted that this was all just a cheap provocation, but she decided to hang on to it. Worried, Howard asked the saint if she was really going to use the enslavement technique. In response, the girl replied that she was a saint, which means God loved her much more than her opponents. And then Scott finally attacks again. Suddenly the girl casts a spell, and the earth begins to change its shape and stretch out. Before he can hit Lillian, Scott himself is hit by a stone ledge, which is the work of the saint. Next, the girl calls on the wind, and the wind begins to rage around her with green sparks, fluttering her hair. These wind streams form a hurricane, which, after hitting Scott, throws him up, stunning him. But fortunately, the guy is caught by Ryan, who is still hanging in the air. Next, Lillian summons fire, and directing his hand towards one of the guys, sets it on fire. Then she calls for water, and a huge drop of water rises above her hand. With the help of this drop, the girl catches a guy in a water trap who wanted to attack her from behind. After the guy in the water bubble passes out from lack of air, the bubble bursts, and the guy falls to the ground. The girl, mockingly, asks that they are really giving up already. But in response, Scott shouts that this is not the end, and let her not think that she has already won. Suddenly, Steve and the others appear on the battlefield, planning to stop this riot before it's too late. The guy, turning to Scott, shouts at him to stop fighting and asks him what he was thinking when he did such a thing. The rebel replies that the guy must force him to stop, because he is not going to sit and do nothing, like him. Steve asks with pretension whether others think the same. Ryan apologizes, but says he can't trust Lillian and Howard. Roxy says she agrees with the guy on this, and she asks why don't they join then, since everything has already begun. In response, Meryl says that not everything is solved by brute force. Suddenly Lillian mockingly notes that the split in their group happened so quickly. The girl says that the riot has already begun, which means that they can't just go their separate ways and pretend like nothing happened. This statement surprises the guys. Meanwhile, while the guys are confused, the saint again calls on the wind, directing its murderous streams at the guys. Noticing this, Ryan decides to try to fight off this attack using his ability, and 2 wind vortices begin to intertwine, moving in the same direction. However, Lillian's whirlwind turns out to be too strong, and therefore Ryan's whirlwind has no effect on him, and all the guys fly away under the influence of these whirlwinds. Steve managed to stay on his feet after this attack, driving several meters along the grass. The rest of the guys were not so lucky, and they fell to the ground bruised. Steve turned to the guys in a panic and asked them if they were okay. Scott suddenly appeared behind him and, making wheezing sounds, told the guy not to worry, because no one died. The rebel shouted to the guy that he couldn't save everyone, and therefore he needed to make a decision quickly, otherwise the saint would kill them all. In response to this, the swordsman said that there was no way out, stood up and took the sword in his hands, preparing to defend himself. Roxy was glad that the guy finally realized it, because her patience was already at its limit, and she was already preparing to attack with fire in her hands. Meryl said that she didn't really want to take part in all this, but there was nothing she could do. The 5 boys stood in front of Lillian and the wounded Howard, ready to fight again. The saint decided to explain to the children why she is so valuable. At the same time, Rosie was hiding behind a tree and asking what they should do now. Kyle replied that the real fun would start when she used the enslavement technique, and until then they would leave all the dirty work to the guys. Howard stood before his mistress, holding his sword in his hands, and asked permission to speak first. Lillian allowed Howard to fight, but decided to help him a little by extending her hand, which glowed green. At the same moment, the same green light enveloped the armless knight, healing all his wounds. And now a healthy knight, who seemed not to have been wounded earlier, stood in front of the guys, ready to attack. Ryan complained that now the knight was as good as new, and they had spent so much effort on him. Roxy noticed that their strength had increased, and now they were all fighting together. Lillian asked that the boys start when they were ready and said that this battle would be a great test for them. And the saint also said that if they cannot defeat them, then naturally they will not become heroes. Steve struck first. He swung his sword at Howard, but he blocked his attack. However, the knight's sword was damaged, and instead of continuing, the man decided to increase the distance. The man noted that since the sword was damaged, it would not be possible to simply block attacks. At the same moment, Lillian summoned ice, which she ordered to take shape and pierce her enemy. The next second, ice arrows flew at the guy with great speed, which discouraged the guy. Roxy, holding out her hand and shooting a fireball out of it, said that she would simply melt those arrows. The fireball, having reached the ice, was indeed able to melt it, causing drops of water to begin to fall to the ground. The saint, still smiling, defiantly asked if the girl could do it again, and then again pieces of ice flew at Steve. Since Roxy could not help this time, the guy decided to cut these ice arrows, but there were too many of them, and several still hit him, leaving wounds. To protect their leader, Meryl and Ryan also decided to attack. They called upon stones and wind. At great speed, stones and gusts of wind that could cut a person flew towards Lillian, but she did not even think about dodging or defending herself. The next second, a barrier appeared around the saint, which is why the attacks did not reach the girl, and the stones fell to the ground. The girl explained that she was God's favorite, and therefore witchcraft and blessings did not affect her. Kyle, who was hiding behind a tree, suggested that this was the blessing of the saint. Having used his ability, the guy noticed that the girl's defense indicators are low. But with such blessings, she doesn't really need them, and therefore the physical attack from which Howard protects her should work. At the same moment there was a battle between Howard and Scott, and right now the guy kicked the knight in the head, but he managed to defend himself with his hands. Noticing that the guy was no longer attacking with explosions, the man mockingly noted that he was already exhausted. In response to this, Scott confidently said that he could easily make a man even without the ability, and then the guy told Steve, who was standing behind him, that he was taking over Howard, and he had to deal with Lillian. Steve agreed with this plan and began to think about how to defeat the saint. Looking at the girl and his sword, he noticed that because of her ability, his sword would not help him much. Suddenly someone threw him the most ordinary sword in a sheath. The saint, a little mockingly, asked the guy if he had finally developed the determination to fight. Remembering what Kyle told him, Steve replied that someone had screwed him up, and then declared that he would cut off the girl's head. Finally, Lillian began the battle and launched pink flashes at the guy, which he successfully fought off. Roxy noticed that they couldn't help Steve, because blessings don't work on the saint, and Ryan noticed that they couldn't help Scott either, because he was fighting closely with Howard, which means their blessings could hurt him too. Finally getting to her feet, Meryl summed up that they could only watch, otherwise they would only get in the way. Meanwhile, Howard and Scott continued their pitched battle. The knight swung his sword, but the guy successfully dodged the blow, crouching down sharply, and then he struck the man in the face with his fist from below, but he also dodged by leaning back. At the same moment, the guy suddenly fell to the ground and with a sharp movement of his leg knocked the knight off his feet, and then, when the man was discouraged, he stabbed him in the chest. This blow sent Howard back several meters. Scott told the man that he was slowing down, because even if he was treated, they did not add strength to him. But the knight countered this statement, saying that the guy could no longer use his ability. Meanwhile, Lillian launched several fireballs at Steve, but these balls landed on the ground, because the guy was able to dodge them by jumping back. The guy noted that at this rate the saint could kill him before he could get closer, and he began to actively think about another way to defeat Lillian. The girl praised the guy, saying that few people could evade her techniques so deftly. The guy noticed that until he got closer to the girl, everything he did would be useless, and he immediately began to ask questions about what to do, whether he should try to get closer or should he find a way to attack from a distance. Having decided that he should nevertheless close the distance between them, because the guy's blessings do not work, and Lillian herself specializes in long-range combat, Steve realized that he needed to act as quickly as possible, and the blue light began to envelop him. Suddenly something surprised Lillian so much that she opened her eyes. It turns out that the guy, engulfed in a blue glow, suddenly took off with great speed. In response to this, the saint decided to call on the wind, and wind arrows flew towards the guy. However, this did not bother the guy at all. He continued to close the distance between them with a blank look. Suddenly the girl crouched down and touched the ground, casting a spell, and then the earth began to become liquid and suck the guy in like quicksand. Meanwhile, without wasting a second, the girl summoned fire, which materialized in her hand, and while Steve sank deeper and deeper, she set him on fire, causing the guy to scream. Lillian was surprised to note the guy's incredible talent, because all this time he had been unconsciously feeding his body with magic, and then was able to release all the power out. However, the saint noticed that the guy was still no match for her, because he was already lying unconscious on the ground in charred armor. Meanwhile, Howard and Scott stood at a distance from each other, ready to attack at any second. The guy was thinking about how he could defeat the man, because he would no longer be able to use the explosion. But then the knight quickly rushed at the guy, noting that he saw doubt on his face. And this time Scott was unable to dodge, and the blow landed right on the guy's chest, and blood poured out of the wound. Clutching the wound with his hand, the guy thought angrily about what was happening to him, because he was losing to a half-dead old man. Putting the guy on his knees, pressing the tip of the sword to the guy's shoulder, the man asked if this was all he could do without his blessing, and said that he was an amateur after all. But remembering how in his home world he fought with his fists, Scott confidently thought that he was strong enough without the ability. Suddenly he began to stand up while the tip of the sword was still on his shoulder, causing the man to be surprised. Confused, Howard asked how he could still stand. Meanwhile, the tip of the knife entered deeper and deeper into the guy's body, bringing successful pain. Suddenly the guy clenched his fist tightly, and he hit the man hard in the face, screaming in anger. The man did not dodge this blow and instantly flew to the ground. The man landed and found himself unconscious, blood pouring from his mouth, and it looked like Scott had knocked out a couple of his teeth. The guy announced that he had won after all. Meanwhile, Steve remembered the days with his classmates in the previous world, and thought that he had to protect everything, that he did not want to see his friends suffer. And then the guy's body was engulfed by blue discharges, and his face expressed nothing. Preparing to attack the rest of the guys, Lillian turned to the guy, noticing that he was surprisingly resilient. And then, with disdain, she noticed that no matter how hard he tried to get closer to her, but the girl did not have time to finish, because in an instant Steve appeared at her side, swinging his sword at her. Feeling this, the saint looked sharply in that direction in surprise, opening her eyes. Meanwhile, a guy with an expressionless face struck. However, Lillian still managed to jump away from the guy. But still, this attack did not pass without a trace, because Steve was able to injure the girl, and a wound appeared on her hand, from which blood flowed. The saint thought with surprise that she had really lost her vigilance, but then she realized that this was not the case at all. Meanwhile, the guy did not retreat, and in a second he found himself behind the saint. Turning around, the girl instantly summoned ice, which in a huge mass headed towards the guy. But, as if in a trance, the guy continued to advance and struck again, cutting the ice, and the girl only managed to cover her face with her hands. But the girl again jumped away from the guy. At the same time, the saint realized that it was not she who acted carelessly, but it was Steve who was too fast to be followed. Lillian suggested that the guy receive the blessing of speed, and since God gave him the desired strength, then he also loves him, just like herself. Steve replied that he simply asked for an ability that would help him protect his loved ones, and activated speed again. And a second later he found himself right in front of the saint, and his sword was pointed at her throat. But the girl said that this was still not enough, and suddenly everything around was filled with golden light, and the guy was crushed to the ground so that he could not move. Looking down at the guy, the saint said that she didn't want to use this ability, but it looks like she has no choice. Noticing this, Kyle, who was still in the shelter, said that it was time for them to start. Lillian says she didn't expect to have to use the enslavement technique, but Steve meets all her expectations. Roxy, noticing that Steve was under control, wanted to run to him and save him, but then the saint tells them to freeze, and now all the guys are under the enslavement technique. Lillian announces that the guys passed the test and did a great job, but turning to Howard, she notes that she did not predict his defeat, but it does not matter, because there will always be another night. The girl says that any problem can be solved as long as the hero candidates are under her control. Ryan, being under control, asks that they really got into a fight without a single chance of winning. Steve realizes that until they find a way to deal with this technique, they won't succeed. The saint talks about how she was allowed to perform the ritual of summoning hero candidates because she can control them, otherwise their existence could become a potential threat to the state. But suddenly 3 knives fly out from somewhere. Lillian instantly summons Earth, which forms a shield, and the knives miss their target, crashing into this shield. Afterwards, the shield disintegrates, turning into sand, and the knives fall to the ground. The girl says that she kept wondering where he was hiding, and asks him whether it was his fault that her dear servants died. Meanwhile, Kyle enters the battlefield. Kyle says he's surprised that a simple guy like him could get her attention. Lillian replies that the guy seemed strange to her from the very beginning, because even after receiving the blessing, he did not react in any way, and it is difficult to call him an amateur. And then the girl declares that she is disappointed in Kyle, because he should have thought twice before getting involved in an initially losing battle. Kyle replies that it is up to him to decide if this is a losing battle or not. The saint defiantly replies that he should try to prove the opposite to her, and then, using her ability again, Lillian takes control of the guy, and he finds himself sealed in a vortex of orange light. After this, Lillian tries to say that as long as this technique exists, it is invincible, but does not have time to finish. Suddenly a bullet hits the saint in the shoulder, and blood begins to flow from the wound. It turns out that Kyle was not under control and was able to take a pistol out of his raincoat and shoot, and then noticed that the girl immediately covered all the important points. Lillian screamed in panic, asking why the guy could still move, since she had squatted on him with the enslavement technique. But instead of answering, the guy fires a second bullet, and it lands in the saint's stomach. The girl asks what kind of weapon it is, and notes that her defenses cannot keep up with it. Kyle replies that it is one of the deadliest weapons from his world and that he doesn't have much ammo left, so he tries not to use it as often. The girl tries to calm down, not understanding why her technique does not work on the guy, and telling herself that something else is more important now, and then calls on fire. And a huge wave of fire begins to move straight towards Kyle. Lillian proudly declares that the guy has let his guard down, but then he notices that there is no guy on fire, but only his cloak. Meanwhile, Kyle is behind the saint and points a gun right at the back of the girl's head, telling her not to move. The guy says that after her fight with Steve, he realized that the girl is not strong in close-range battles, and the technique she relied on so much does not work on him, in response to which Lillian asks him why the technique is on him does not work. But Kyle does not answer the question, but only sarcastically asks why his ability works on him, at the same time thinking that he was not entirely sure that this adventure would work, but everything went as well as possible. Last night, Kyle asked Rosie to use her control on him. At this request, the girl pressed herself against the front door, dumbfounded. Blushing a little, the girl replied that she was not into that kind of thing, to which the guy asked what she was even talking about. And Kyle tells Rosie that while he was researching materials about techniques, He did not find information about the enslavement technique. However, instead he received very interesting facts. The guy says that if two subjugating type techniques are applied to one person, then the technique that was applied first will have priority. Surprised, Rosie asks what happens if she is the first to put control on Kyle. Then the enslavement technique will have no effect. The guy replied that this is quite possible, and it is also possible if her technique surpasses Lillian's divine protection. The girl notes that her strength cannot match her enslaving technique, either in scale nor in power. In response, the guy says that the main difference is in the level of technology. Then Rosie asks that if she casts control first, Lillian might interrupt the spell, because she is much stronger than the girl, to which Kyle replies that this is unlikely. And he remembers that then Sam's technique also took over her control, and then he explains that he used to think that the monsters obeyed the scientist, since the level of his technique was higher. But this is not so. This happened because he would apply the technique first. And knowing this, the guy suggested that it was possible that Lillian's enslavement technique worked on the same principles. Kyle said that, be that as it may, it is best to test all this in practice, and first you need to find out the range of the control. Meanwhile, Lillian realized that because of Rosie, her technique did not work. Still holding the gun to the saint's head, Kyle asked what had finally dawned on her. Rosie came out from behind the bushes, and while the guy was engulfed in purple light, he announced that he was now under control. Lillian hissed, gritting her teeth, calling the girl a cheeky wannabe. Kyle announced that this was the end. Suddenly, the guy put the gun away, and the saint fell to the ground. They also put shackles on her that blocked her powers. Kyle said that he borrowed these shackles from members of the demon sect, and it seems that they also block Lillian's miraculous power. Looking at the guy, the saint asked with suspicion what he was going to do with her. The guy announced that if the saint could immediately return the guys back to their world, then he would free her. Lillian, shaking her head, replied that she could not do this, because in order to send them away, a completely different technique was needed, with which she was not familiar. Kyle used his ability to check whether the saint was telling the truth, and concluded that she was not lying, and her status did not include such a skill. Then the guy responded by asking why she told them that if they defeated the Demon King, they would be able to return home. The saint replied that calling people from another world requires a huge amount of miraculous powers, and in order to receive it, they turn to God himself to transfer them here, which means that the children stay in this world as God's will, and when they fulfill their role, they are most likely to return back. Hearing uncertainty about the fact that they would be brought back after killing the Demon King, the guy asked that the girl herself did not fully believe in this. Lillian agrees, because before the guys she had already called for hero candidates, but none of them managed to even get close to the Demon King. In response to this, Kyle asked, although he already knew the most likely answer, what happened to the previous candidates. The saint replied that almost everyone was killed by the army of the Demon King, and if there were survivors, she did not know where they were hiding. The guy noticed that anyone would give up after something like this, which is probably why she didn't tell them. The girl said threateningly that even if they wanted to settle here, sooner or later the army of the Demon King would attack and they would have to fight. Kyle concluded that ultimately they had no choice. The saint agreed with this and said that they need to let her go, and then she will turn a blind eye to this incident, and the country will support them so that the guys survive the battle. But the guy did not consider these arguments weighty enough, and therefore began to swing his hand with a knife to kill the girl. Suddenly, Steve, who had come to his senses, stopped Kyle by grabbing him by the shoulder. Kyle asked why the guy was stopping him, because it seemed to him that he had already decided to cross the line, and he knocked all naive thoughts out of him. Steve responded that he only agreed to help because he believed Lillian knew how to get them home instantly, and since that was impossible, he wanted to maintain his status as a hero candidate. The guy decides to remind the other guy that they started a riot. But then Lillian speaks up and says that she agrees with Steve. The girl admits that she got a little carried away and invites them to imagine that none of this happened. Kyle mentally admits that there is logic in this decision, but he already says out loud that the girl is too dangerous, and they won't be able to take her by surprise a second time. The guy assumes that as soon as they free the saint, she will immediately attack Rosie. Steve, in response, says that they will not be able to escape punishment for killing the saint, and instead of killing them, they can take an oath from the girl that in the future she will treat them better and free her. Meryl agrees with the guy and says that not all of their guys know how to fight, and if they become criminals, then they can only dream of defeating the Demon King. Roxy says that she is against killing, because somehow they will find a way to force the saint to keep her promise. Ryan is preparing what kind of murder he is, because he doesn't trust Lillian, because she almost killed them, and who knows what will stop her from finishing what she started. Steve agrees that the saint may want to finish what she started, and says that if they kill her, then they will have no chance at all. Kyle understands why the guy is worried, because he wants to ensure the safety of the whole class. He could survive on his own, and therefore he cannot act rashly. And having found a solution, the guy shoots Lillian. The bullet crashes directly into the saint's forehead, causing her to sigh in surprise, and the girl falls to the ground dead. Her hat flies off and her eyes roll back. After saying goodbye to Steve, Kyle throws a smoke bomb and hides in the smoke screen. The smoke begins to clear, and not a trace remains of the guy. In despair, Steve falls to his knees, asking why he did this. Meryl says that Kyle killed her before they came to a common decision, and therefore it is unforgivable. Roxy noticed that the guy acted as usual, thinking only about himself. However, Ryan did not become indignant, perhaps realizing that there was something other than selfishness in this action. Rosie, with a blank face, began to approach the saint's corpse. The girl could not believe that Kyle still killed the saint, and that everything happened exactly as he said. About an hour earlier, while Rosie and Kyle were hiding behind the trees, the guy decided to tell the girl what would happen next. The guy said that their main goal is to capture Lillian and find out from her how they can return back to their world, and if it turns out that the saint is incapable of this, he will kill her. The girl hesitantly agreed, accepting this plan. The guy continued and said that even if it turns out that going back is not so easy, Steve will still protect Lillian, and at this point he will kill her and run away. Rosie couldn't believe that Kyle was going to take the blame for killing the saint. The guy said that for this reason he allowed several soldiers to escape, so that they would create the appearance that he was the only one who staged a riot, because if only he was considered a criminal, then everyone else would be able to return to the country without problems. But Rosie doubted that this would all pass smooth. Kyle noted that in order for everything to go smoothly, he needs the strength of a girl who can, if anything, help in negotiations with the country. Nodding and blushing a little because the guy believed in her so much, Rosie asked what he would do next. Remembering that, Kyle replied that he could handle it himself, and the girl did not need to worry about him. She looked into the distance with excitement. Somewhere far away in the forest, under the pink light of the moon, stood a gloomy castle. Someone asked another about hero candidates, strangers from another world blessed by God. Standing on the carpet lying in front of the throne, someone on his knees replied that they had made several attempts to eliminate them, but they all failed. To which the one who was sitting on the throne replied that the other had nothing to worry about, because ultimately, their actions in enemy territory are limited, and even if they leave them alone, candidates will show up sooner or later. It turns out that sitting on the throne was the High General of the Demon King's army, one of the 4 heavenly kings, namely the Wind King, William, and he said that he thought that the war with humanity would be quick, but now things are getting interesting. The sun is shining and Kyle is walking through the forest with a backpack. He stops by the river to quench his thirst. After drinking a little water, he wipes his mouth with his sleeve and thinks that he has been walking for the 2nd day, and, judging by the map, there should be a city nearby. And in order to see the area better, he decides to climb higher, for example, onto a mountain. Standing on the top of the mountain, the guy examines the area and notices a city in the distance. Kyle estimates that this city is about half a day away. By the time he reached the walls of the city, it was already dark, but this was even better for the guy, because he needed not to be noticed, and therefore he approached the walls, hiding in the tall, thick grass. The guy suggested that the murderer of the saint would not be allowed through the main gate, and maybe they would do something worse. A hook is hooked onto the city wall, to which a rope is tied, and Kyle begins to climb up the wall. After he climbed over the wall, the guy leisurely strolls around the city. Walking down the street, he outlines a plan for himself, the first point of which is that he needs to get money. Tossing a small bag, Kyle notes that he borrowed some money from the dead soldiers, but it won't last long. Suddenly he notices a bar and decides to go in, because you can't think of a better place to gather information. At night the bar is noisy, people are everywhere, talking, laughing, drinking and eating. The bar owner, noticing that someone has entered, greets the guest and asks what he will order. Sitting down at the bar, Kyle orders an ale and something to chew. The bar patron sitting next to the guy says that he has not seen him before and asks, while drinking alcohol from a mug, if he is a traveler. The guy replies that he had to flee his hometown, and now he is looking for something to earn a living. Tearing up, the man suggests that his city was attacked by the army of the Demon King, and says that this is a real disaster. Kyle notes how fortunate it is that the interlocutor himself came up with the story for him, and then asks if he knows where undocumented refugees are hired here. Together, the men answer, placing a mug of ale in front of the guy, the owner, that he needs to become an adventurer. Taking a mug of alcohol in his hands, the guy asks about who the adventurers are and what they do. The owner replies that adventurers usually destroy monsters upon request from the guild. Suddenly the visitor says that this job is not for weaklings, and that he cannot cope with it, to which the owner replies that he immediately noticed that Kyle is not a weakling. The man, turning to the guy, asks if the other guessed right, and says that it's not surprising that he's not a weakling, because he's traveling alone. The guy replies that he can kill the monster. Kyle asks how he can become an adventurer. The owner, stirring the soup, replies that it's easy, and all you need to do is register with the guild in the city center, and says that the guild always needs workers, and they don't pick on documents. The guy notes that the man knows a lot, to which he replies that he himself used to be an adventurer, but he was shot in the knee and that's where his adventures ended. And then he puts fried chicken and soup in front of the guy. The next morning, Kyle wakes up in a hotel. Approaching the counter, he thanks the girl and says that he will stay here for some time. The girl, with a smile on her face, thanks him for choosing their hotel. Leaving the hotel, the guy notes that the girl did not react to his face. Kyle is glad that photography has not yet been invented here, which means there is no point in being overly cautious. Kyle approaches the guild doors. Above the doors there is an emblem, which represents a shield and two crossed swords. The guy opens the door and enters the room in which there is a hubbub. A little later he finds a reception desk where a man is sitting. Approaching the counter, Kyle says that he wants to register as an adventurer, to which the girl says that the registration fee is 1 silver coin. The guy hands the girl the silver coin. Afterwards, the girl asks the guy to tell him his name, age and origin. The guy suggests that you shouldn't tell them your real name. Kyle introduces himself as Steven, and then says that he is 17 years old, and his hometown was destroyed by the army of the Demon King. Writing everything down, the girl replies that this information is enough for registration. The guy thanks the girl for her help, and he himself thinks that he did not expect that his code name from his world would be useful to him. When completing registration, the girl puts a stamp on the form, which represents the emblem of the guild, and then she begins to briefly talk about the activities of the adventurers. The girl talks about how each adventurer is assigned a rank depending on their achievements and abilities, which determines the reward and difficulty of the task. Afterwards, the girl reports that Kyle is a newbie, and therefore he is assigned rank F, and in order to increase his rank he needs to fulfill requests and earn a reputation. Pointing to the board, the girl says that this is a task board and the guy should look for F rank requests. Approaching the task board, Kyle begins to carefully examine the tasks. Having examined rank F tasks, the guy concludes that rank F requests mainly involve collecting medicinal herbs and killing kobolds. Kyle decides to take on the task of killing the kobolds. Suddenly 3 others approach the guy, and one says that he hasn't seen him here before, the second says that he better forget about the battle with the kobolds, and the third says that they will quickly kill such a weakling as Kayla. This performance makes the guy's eye twitch. Kyle advises the guys to turn around and leave here without making too much noise. Such insolence infuriated the boys. Others in the guild noticed this quarrel involving these guys of yours, which was clearly not the first, and I sympathize with the newcomer. The first guy shouts out that no one taught Kyle any manners, and he starts to reach out to him, when suddenly Kyle grabs his wrist. The guy who decided to start a fight clearly didn't expect this, and then he screams for the other to let him go. But Kyle doesn't heed his words and breaks his wrist. Afterwards the guy turns to his friends and tells them to teach Kyle some manners, and the next second, the other 2 guys attack Kyle from both sides. However, they soon all find themselves lying unconscious on the floor, and Kyle, under the surprised glances of others, leaves with the task in his hands. The guy notes that these mid-level adventurers are many times weaker than any of the hero candidates. Walking out the door of the guild building, the guy finds himself on the street and decides to complete the task. To complete his task, Kyle needed to go into the forest. Looking around, the guy remembers that, Based on the information in the request, the kobold base should be somewhere here. Suddenly he notices footprints on the ground in front of him, and then he notes that these traces are very fresh. Kyle went in the direction where the tracks were leading him and noted that these tracks looked like those of an animal. The guy follows these tracks, making his way through the bushes. Having walked a little more, he notices more tracks and thinks that those who own these tracks hide their presence very well, and assumes that these are the kobolds. Suddenly, behind Kyle there appears a monster that looks like a wolf, standing on 2 legs, and holding a bloody sword in its paws. This monster, spraying saliva, attacks the guy, striking with a sword, but Kyle manages to dodge by jumping back.